Present us, O Lord, in all our doings with thy most gracious favour, and further us with thy continual help, that in all our works begun, continued, and ended in thee, we may glorify thy holy name, and finally by thy mercy attain everlasting life. Amen. Introduction of guests. I recognize the Minister of Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask leave for an extended introduction.
Minister has asked leave for an extended introduction. Is leave granted? Recognize the Minister.
Mr. Speaker, to you and through you and to all members of the Assembly, I'm honoured to introduce some important guests who have joined us here in the Legislature today. They are here with us on International Day of Persons with Disabilities to help celebrate the successful transition of people from Valley View Centre to homes and communities of their choice. Mr. Speaker, seated on the floor of the chamber are some folks who used to live at Valley View Centre, but now reside in homes and communities of their choice across our province. Mr. Speaker, we have Larry Moss, who I've been told who loves going to watch the Saskatchewan Rush play and going to the car races and being closer to his brothers and family. We have Mary Scott, who loves that she now lives closer to her brother Mark, is also here with us today. I have Jack Good, who loves attending floor hockey, bowling, movies, and shopping with his staffs, and I just found out he's a huge Riders as well as a Calgary Flames fan.
Good man.
Mr. Speaker, we have Eric Cameron, who loves that he has his own room and his privacy, and he also enjoys bowling and watching various sports. We have Gary Sells, who enjoys working with the vocational programs through the Southwest Homes, so now he can visit his hometown regularly. And we have some of the support staff here from Saskatoon Alternative Initiatives, Citizens All for Moose Jaw, Southwest Homes in Swift Current, and Chippendale and Regina. Seated in the Speaker's Gallery, we have Carol, John, Helen, and Lauren, representatives on behalf of the Valley View Legacy Network, as well as Elena Harrison, Director of Strategic Initiatives at Inclusion Saskatchewan, and Tara Belanger from Inclusion Saskatchewan. The Legacy Network and Inclusion Saskatchewan were instrumental in working with the Ministry of Social Services on the successful transition of 153 residents from Valley View. Each resident participated in the creation of an individualized plan that included which community they wanted to live in, who they wanted to live with, what supports would be needed, and what their interests and hobbies that they wanted to keep up with in their new home. Most important goal was ensuring that each resident's transition was successful and they were happy within their new homes. It is important that we have moved away from institutionalized living and that communities across Saskatchewan have welcomed the 36 new group homes these folks now call home. Myself and other MLAs have been fortunate enough to meet many of these folks at group home events over the past few years. Larry, Mary, Jack, Eric, and Gary, thank you for coming and joining us here today. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to welcome all of them to their Legislative Assembly.
Recognize the member for Prince Albert and Northcote.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to join with the Minister across and also welcome our guests here to their Assembly. It's wonderful to see that you're able to attend here, and we're really happy to see that you're in the homes that you've chosen and have your own room. And I've gone to a few of these group homes that the Minister was talking about, and they're just wonderful placements for you and your family, and being closer to your family is so important. And I want to thank the folks here from Inclusion Saskatchewan and also the Legacy Network. And thank you for all your work with helping with the Minister of Social Services and their staff to accommodate for this smooth transition and allowing individuals to be successful in their new homes and having these locations across Saskatchewan. It's wonderful to have this inclusion in our communities, and we want to thank you for everything you've done. So on behalf of the official opposition, we want to welcome you to your legislature. So thank you.
Recognize the Minister of Rural and Remote Health.
I'd like to ask for an extended leave.
Ministers ask leave for an extended introduction. Leave granted.
It's getting close to the end of the week.
I didn't even name you. But go ahead, Minister.
We're all here together now, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To you and all members of the Assembly, I'm pleased to introduce in the front row of the West Gallery representatives of Saskatchewan Seniors Mechanism and the community that they have awarded with age-friendly community status this year is the City of Saskatoon. Mr. Speaker, the Government of Saskatchewan and the Saskatchewan Seniors Mechanism have partnered to present this award, and we're pleased to have representatives from Saskatoon join us here today. I'd like to recognize from the Saskatchewan Seniors Mechanism, Randy Dove, President of the Saskatchewan Seniors Mechanism, Holly Schick, the Executive Director, Robert Wuscheni, Chair of the Age-Friendly Saskatchewan Committee, Linda Anderson, Michelle Sorensen, Shirley Dixon, and Dale Williams. Representing the Age-Friendly Saskatoon Committee are Jim Wazelenko, June Godden, Fred Sutter, Murray Sharp, Paul Benson, Elliot Paz-Jensen, Mercedes Montgomery, Virginia Dakaniewicz, and Foro Yazdani. I welcome you all here today. Mr. Speaker, the Government of Saskatchewan supports the Age-Friendly Communities Initiative, which promotes healthy, accessible, inclusive communities where all individuals are valued and supported. The City of Saskatoon has created an environment to be more inclusive of seniors, leading to communities that are more inclusive of all people. Mr. Speaker, I ask all members to join me to thank the Saskatchewan Seniors Mechanism for working with this community and to acknowledge the City of Saskatoon and the Age-Friendly Saskatoon Committee for their efforts in making Saskatoon more age-friendly and inclusive. Mr. Speaker, while I'm on my feet, seated in the top of the East Gallery, I would like to introduce Paul Hills, President of the Saskatoon Paramedics Association. Appreciate our very engaging discussions about the future of paramedicine in both Saskatoon and in Saskatchewan. I'd like all members of the Assembly to welcome Paul Hills to his Legislative Assembly.
And as a member for Saskatoon Riversdale.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to join with the minister opposite in welcoming folks from the Seniors Mechanism here today, and also the Age-Friendly Committee in Saskatoon, which is, I believe, a committee of the Saskatoon Council on Aging, which does really great work, both in providing a hub for seniors in Saskatoon, but also a lot of the policy work and advocating to us as legislators or to City Council to make sure we all understand the benefit that comes to all people in the community when we are age-friendly, when we support and make sure all those at the more mature adults and the youngest and everybody in between benefits from making sure we have that age-friendly community. So I want to welcome the Seniors Mechanism and the folks from the Saskatoon Council on Aging here today, and I'd ask all members to join with me as well. While I'm on my feet, Mr. Speaker, I would just like to give a shout out to the Saskatchewan Professional Firefighters Association here today. They're in both galleries here today. They have done tremendous work over more than and paramedics who are members of the Firefighters Association, but they do great work in making sure, again, as legislators, we know their issues, and their issues aren't just important to them because they're firefighters and paramedics, but they're issues that are important to the people of Saskatchewan to make sure that we have what we need. So thank you for all the work that you do in supporting your members and in making sure that people in Saskatchewan are well supported. So I'd ask all members to join me in welcoming the SPFFA to their legislature.
I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to join with the member opposite in welcoming the professional firefighters and paramedics to the Assembly today. Mr. Speaker, these are a group of people that ensure they are the front line on keeping us all safe, and fortunately most of us don't need their services very often, but I'm sure at some point in our life we will know somebody that will, or we'll need it ourselves, and for that we very much appreciate the work that they do, and they make our province the better place that it is already. So, Mr. Speaker, on behalf of all members, we want to welcome them and thank them for the work that they're continuing to do, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to join with the other members on both sides in welcoming the folks from the Seniors Mechanism and Council on Aging. And I do want to point out one particular person who's with the group, and that's Ms. Elliot Paz-Jensen, who's a Meewasin constituent and a real leader in our community. Great to see her. We visited there on 4th Avenue a few times. Lovely to see her in her legislature. And while I'm on my feet, I'd also like to join in the welcome to the folks from the Saskatchewan Professional Firefighters and Paramedics Association. We had the opportunity to meet with President Lloyd Zwack, with Vice President Paul Hills, and Secretary Treasurer Neil Matichuk, along with the rest of the group, and hear some of the concerns they've brought with their members who are here from Moose Jaw, Regina, Saskatoon, Prince Albert, Yorkton, Swift Current, North Battleford, and Weyburn. And we heard them bring forward their concerns about making sure that wherever folks are working, wherever they're living, they're able to bargain fairly, regardless of the size of the community they are in. We heard about the importance of safety, making sure that there are blue lights and snow tires on the vehicles so that they're able to be safe on the roads, and that we will also want to make sure that we make the take fullest advantage of the services in emergency response and health provision that they're able to provide. As we head forward into the holidays, as we think about the time ahead, many of us are thinking about time off, many of us are looking to relax. And these folks are on duty 24/7, 365 days a year. They keep us safe, and we're very thankful for their service and their commitment, and ask all members to join me in the spirit of the work that they do in welcoming them warmly to their Legislative Assembly.
Recognize Minister of Highways.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to join with members on both sides of the House to welcome the professional firefighters and paramedics here, Mr. Speaker, but two individuals in particular. I don't get to interact with these groups as much as I did in my former role, but Neil Matichuk from Yorkton, the Secretary, is a good friend of mine I've known for decades. The community work he's done in the past through Kinsman and his current community involvement is second to none, Mr. Speaker. So I want to recognize Neil and his assembly, and also Paul Hills, who, through my work in the former portfolio, great advocate for the professional firefighters, but also became a very good friend. We had a great visit today, talked a little bit of business, a lot of personal stuff, Mr. Speaker, so I'd like to welcome both of these friends to their Legislative Assembly.
Recognize the member for Regina Lakeview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is with great pleasure that I rise this afternoon and welcome a school group here from the Crescent School in Regina Lakeview. We have a group of 19 grade 8 students with us today, along with their teacher, Adrian Sklar, as well as Glenn Sawatsky. And we also have their teaching assistant, Tess, with us today. Mr. Speaker, I look forward to meeting with these young students after question period, and I hope that they have a lot of good questions for us, and I invite all members to join me in welcoming them to their Legislative Assembly. And while I'm on my feet, Mr. Speaker, briefly I'd like to acknowledge a couple of guests, one seated in the East Gallery and one on the floor of this Assembly, constituents of Regina Lakeview, noted activists, and certainly neither of them a stranger to this place. I would like to welcome Maureen Eckstein and Florence Stratton here this afternoon. And I just want to say, on behalf of the official opposition, thank you for all you do in your community to ensure work in service of the greater good. I invite all members to join me in welcoming them to their Legislative Assembly.
Recognize the Minister of Advanced Education.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's always nice to come into the Assembly and see a friendly face, and in the West Gallery today, I see Jonathan Tremblay, who is a very active member of the Francophone community in my constituency, a very proud dad as well, someone I've gotten to know recently for all of his work and advocacy on the Francophone on behalf of Francophone people in our community, and Google Translate will only get me so far, Mr. Speaker, so I'll just say bienvenue, Jonathan, and invite all members to join me in welcoming him to his Legislative Assembly.
Recognize the member for Regina Rosemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to join in a very brief and warm welcome to the Saskatchewan Professional Firefighters and Paramedics Association, we look forward to this day each and every year. This year, though, has special meaning, and there's a legacy that's living on. If you recognize, it's been named this year the Jerry Huguet Fall Lobby Day. And of course, Jerry Huguet's is a legend that we've lost. Somebody that's given so much as a distinguished firefighter in Regina, someone who's given so much to the profession and to community safety across Saskatchewan through his advocacy. So to these firefighters, to the paramedics, I say thank you to them for allowing Jerry Huguet's legacy to live on in their service. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
As the member for Saskatoon Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to also introduce some friends here who are sitting in the legislature. But first, to acknowledge the folks from Age Friendly, the Council on Aging from Saskatoon, June, and Virginia Danakowicz from Caswell Hill. It's great to see my neighbour here, Elliot, too. For many years, we've worked together on senior issues, as well as we have some folks here that I'd like to introduce from Transportation for All. And that's on your floor, Mr. Speaker, Terry Sleva and caregiver Mackenzie Kotzlak. And I understand Judy Winsip is here at Florence Stratton and Greg McDonald, all here for the International Day of Persons with Disabilities. I'd ask all members to join me in welcoming them to their legislature. Thank you.
As a member for Regina Northeast.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to introduce some guests here in your gallery, Mr. Speaker. These are gentlemen from the RMs of Lipton and Kelross and farmers. We have Corey Senft, the Reeve of the RM of Lipton, John Olenek, the Reeve of the RM of Kelross, Warren Lutz, James Slika, Dale Shimmers, Greg Van Leuven, Frank Kosa, and E.J. Fay. So I'd ask all members to join with me in welcoming them to their Legislative Assembly. And while I'm on my feet, Mr. Speaker, I just want to very briefly welcome some other individuals here, all leaders in their communities. Brad Atkinson with the firefighters, and Maureen Eckstein, and my constituent Terry Sleva, our candidate in Last Mountain Touchwood, Tara Nordahl, and our candidate in Indian Head Milestone, Jared Clark, the people from Transportation for All, and the people from the Sask Seniors Mechanism, many of whom I had the pleasure of meeting a couple months ago. So I'd ask that all members join with me in welcoming them to their Legislative Assembly.
As the member for Moose Jaw North.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to join with the member opposite and welcoming the delegation from the RM of Lipton. That's my hometown, and I know a few of the people there, and I certainly welcome them here. It's nice to see them here. It's always nice to see people from Lipton to attend these festivities, and I ask all members to welcome them here as well. Thank you.
Recognize the member for Last Mountain Touchwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to join with the member opposite and my colleague, the member from Moose Jaw North, in welcoming the members from the RM of Lipton and the neighboring RM, as well as Tara Nordahl, as the member opposite mentioned, the candidate for the upcoming election. I noticed some of the council members sitting over there in the speaker's gallery, but with the lights, I wasn't 100% sure who was all there. But now I'm wondering, perhaps this was their road trip, like some high school classes take a road trip to the ledge, and perhaps the RM Council is doing that. But I'd certainly welcome them and ask all members to join me in welcoming them to their assembly.
Presenting petitions, recognize the member from Milford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise today to present a petition from citizens who are opposed to the federal government's decision to impose an unfair and ineffective carbon tax on the province of Saskatchewan. I'd like to read the prayer. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan take the following action: to cause the Government of Saskatchewan to take the necessary steps to stop the federal government from imposing a carbon tax on this good province. Mr. Speaker, this petition is signed by the good citizens of Landis. I do so present.
There's a member for Cumberland.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to present a petition on behalf of residents of northern Saskatchewan. There's a definite need for a new long-term care facility in the Ronge area, and according to the Croft report of 2009, shows the area in code red. There was $500,000 allocated for planning that was spent, and the plan has been ready for years. Seniors are waiting 165 days on average for a bed and are being shipped hours away from loved ones. The prayer reads, "We in the prayer that reads as follows respectfully request that the Sask Party government treat Northern Saskatchewan senior citizens with respect and dignity and immediately invest in a new long-term care facility in La Ronge." Mr. Speaker, this petition is signed by many good people of the North. Letters of support from municipalities are coming in for this letter of petition and letter of support, so I'd like to present this petition on behalf of those residents who deserve much from this government.
There's a member for Regina Rosemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise once again today to present petitions on behalf of concerned citizens, businesses, and communities from right across Saskatchewan as it relates to the Sask Party government's historic and massive hike of the PST. And of course, that was the expansion of the PST as well. And in fact, it doubled the take of the PST from $1 billion to now $2 billion. And of course, that's hit households hard. The average household is now paying more than $800 per year more each and every year than they were just a few years ago, Mr. Speaker. This has hit households hard, but it also hurts our economy. And as it relates to the expansion of the PST onto construction labour, well, quite simply, that's the epitome of a job-killing tax. And sadly, the results speak for themselves. Permits are down across Saskatchewan since its imposition. Projects that are important have been shelved, and thousands of hardworking tradespeople have lost their jobs, Mr. Speaker. So many of those tradespeople that have been forced to move outside of Saskatchewan, a loss for them and their family, and a terrible loss for our province as a whole. And the prayer reads as follows. We in the prayer that reads as follows respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Sask Party government to stop saddling families and businesses with the costs of their mismanagement and immediately reinstate the PST exemption on construction and stop hurting Saskatchewan businesses and families. These petitions today are signed by concerned residents of Waukau and Regina. I so submit.
There's a member for Regina Lakeview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise again this afternoon to present a petition calling on this Assembly to fix the crisis in our classrooms. Those who have signed the petition wish to draw our attention to the following points. That the Sask Party government's cuts mean falling per-student funding and fewer supports for students who need extra help. That the Sask Party government's cuts leave educators without the resources that they need to support their students. And that the Sask Party government is ignoring overcrowding in our classrooms by refusing to track and report on class sizes. Further, Mr. Speaker, that the Sask Party government's lack of funding for school infrastructure has led to crumbling and overcrowded schools right across the province, and that the Sask Party government's failure to invest in our classrooms is having serious consequences today, and Mr. Speaker, that will continue to happen into the future unless we deal with this crisis. I'll read the prayer. We in the prayer that reads as follows respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call upon the Sask Party government to immediately fix the crisis in our classrooms by properly funding the most important investment that we can make in our children. Mr. Speaker, those who have signed the petition today reside in Regina. I do so present.
There's a member for Saskatoon-Newtowner.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm rising today to present additional petitions to the hundreds that I've already submitted regarding the swales in the the South Saskatchewan River. The people who have signed this would like to bring to our attention the following. Ministry of Highways is planning a 4-lane, 4-speed highway around part of Saskatoon and through the swales. The northeast and small swales of Saskatoon provide food and habitat to a number of endangered and declining species and many others not listed as endangered. They're part of our shared natural heritage, and they include rare fescue grassland and high-quality functional wetlands. Mr. Speaker, the provincial government is neglecting its environmental protection duties to adequately protect wild species, habitats, and ecosystems of local, regional, and national and global significance. And, Mr. Speaker, we see that lack of adequate protection is leading to a decrease in many types of wildlife habitat, particularly grassland habitat, declines in species populations and health, and a loss of local, regional, and national biodiversity. Mr. Speaker, highways impact ecosystems through fragmentation, but assessments of the impacts are only done for site-specific boundaries, ignoring the cumulative impacts. I'll read the prayer. In the prayer reads as follows: respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the provincial government to suspend planning for the Saskatoon Freeway and development around the swales until a regional cumulative effects assessment has been completed. Update the Wildlife Act and expand the list of wild species protected by provincial regulation. Recognize the swales as an important ecological habitat and designate them as protected areas, and ensure adequate long-term funding for research, management, and enforcement to protect the swales for generations to come. Mr. Speaker, of the over 50 names that I'm presenting today, most come from Saskatoon, but there are also folks from Rostern, Langham, and Regina. I so submit.
Organizing member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to present a petition on an issue that we've been raising throughout the session, a petition to end unacceptable emergency room wait times. We know that the paramedics that are here today will know all too well about the offload delays and zero alerts that they experience as a result of this crunch, and that emergency rooms are the canary in the coal mine. I would like to raise some awareness to some of the issues that these citizens wish to bring to our attention. That despite the Sask Party government's promise to eliminate emergency room wait times in 2012, wait times in Saskatchewan's emergency rooms continue to grow. That instead of making smart investments to meet emergency room targets, the Sask Party government watered down targets to the point where they no longer exist. And that the Sask Party has cut funding to address emergency room wait times and has no meaningful strategy to get emergency room wait times under control. I would like to read the prayer. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Sask Party government to fully fund and execute a plan, as they promised to do in 2012, to lower and eventually end unacceptable ER wait times across Saskatchewan. This petition is signed by individuals from Moose Jaw, Regina, and Saskatoon. I do so present.
Reading and receiving petitions. Statements by members. Recognize the member for Wood River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Every year, millions of tourists come from near and far to explore our beautiful province. And, Mr. Speaker, when these visitors arrive in Saskatchewan, it is the hospitality of our tourism industry that ensures they have the best possible experience. And, of course, this wouldn't be possible without the dedication that our tourism employees demonstrate every day. Mr. Speaker, last year, a constituent of mine, Brenda Peterson, was awarded the Saskatchewan Tourism Employee of the Year Award for her contribution to the programs at the Grasslands National Park. This year, however, Brenda's performance was noticed across Canada. In 2019, Brenda was a finalist in the Canadian Tourism Awards category for Employee of the Year, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Brenda has worked at Grasslands since 2011, where she began as a heritage presenter. Since then, she's moved into designing programs and growing the number of services offered to visitors. Mr. Speaker, one of her top programs is the Fossil Fever event, which allows up to 12 daily participants the opportunity to search for fossils with real paleontologists. Despite her success, Brenda stays humble and always says she's proud to be from Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, I now invite all members of this Assembly to join me in congratulating Brenda Peterson on becoming a finalist for the Canadian Tourism Awards Employee of the Year. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to recognize International Day of Persons with Disabilities, which is observed annually on December 3rd. This year's theme is promoting the participation of persons with disabilities and their leadership taking action. Mr. Speaker, about 1 billion people live with a disability. Unfortunately, for many of these folks with a disability, equal access and opportunity is not afforded to them in many facets of society, including transportation, education, employment, and social participation. That is why it is so crucial that our roles as legislators, we on both sides of the Assembly, work diligently to ensure that those with disabilities are afforded equitable opportunities to live, work, and play in Saskatchewan. Since first being elected, I have had the honour to meet with many individuals and organizations within the Saskatchewan disability community. For example, this morning with the CNIB, with my colleagues from Regina Rosemont and Saskatoon Fairview. Their strong leadership and advocacy for a fairer and more accessible Saskatchewan is inspiring. Mr. Speaker, we are looking forward to seeing Saskatchewan's accessibility bill that was promised in the 2019 throne speech becoming a reality, and that it is done by fulfilling this year's theme of promoting participation and leadership of people living with disabilities in all its dimensions in our communities. I ask that all members join me in recognizing today the International Day of Persons with Disabilities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
As a member from Moose Jaw, Waccamaw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today is the International Day of Persons with Disabilities, which aims to celebrate and promote the rights and well-being of persons with disabilities in all parts of society. This year's theme is "The Future is Accessible," which is very fitting, Mr. Speaker, as this fall our government finished successfully transitioning Valley View Centre residents into communities of their choice. Mr. Speaker, through this transition, our government focused on making the residents' move as easy as possible, focusing on person-centered approach to ensure each resident felt safe and comfortable during the transition. Travis Neufeld, the Communications and Marketing Manager with Inclusion said, quote, "A person-centered approach was critical to the success of the transition. The contribution of family and friends to each individual's transition was significant," end quote. Our government is working to create new provincial accessibility legislation aimed at removing and preventing accessibility barriers to people with disabilities. It is our commitment to continue implementation of the disability strategy that will help make all of our communities more inclusive. These transitions and this legislation will help make Saskatchewan a more inclusive province that is welcoming, responsive, innovative, and accessible to everyone. A province where everyone can participate and live the life they choose, no matter their abilities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Regina Rosemont.
Mr. Speaker, it was an honour on September 21st to gather with those that serve and protect to celebrate the 100th anniversary of IAFF Local 181, the Regina Professional Firefighters. This was an impressive event with a packed hall that began with the piping in of retired members by the RCMP Pipe Band, along with Local 181 Honour Guard. The 100 years is a remarkable accomplishment. For 100 years, Local 181 members have put their lives on the line to serve and protect our community. And for those 100 years, Local 181 has fought for better protections for people and for firefighters, leading the way with the profession and for the profession in making our community safer. This gala opened with remarks by firefighter Janelle Johnson, and TSN's James Duthie served as a witty and fun master of ceremonies. A highlight of the night was a panel that included retired Deputy Chief Grant Nicurity, retired Captain Kelly Hamilton, and current firefighters Kelly Hogan and the pride of Lumsden, Casey Lawford. And of course, President Tyler Packham addressed this historic event. Local 181 has an incredibly proud legacy of service, and because of its leadership and members, that legacy lives on for the benefit of all of us. I ask all members to join with me in celebrating IAFF Local 181, its members, and leadership, past and present, to simply say thank you.
Recognize the member for Prince Albert, Carleton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this past Friday I had the privilege of joining community leaders in Prince Albert to launch a new health service for the residents of Prince Albert in the north. In the spring budget, our government committed $1.6 million to open 3 specialized RAM clinics in Regina, Saskatoon, and Prince Albert. Mr. Speaker, RAM stands for Rapid Access to Addictions Medicine, and the launch of the Prince Albert Clinic will be the first RAM clinic to open in Saskatchewan. The opening of this clinic will give people timely and easier access to addictions medicine treatment services. We know from experiences on Ontario and Manitoba that RAM clinics help patients get the services they need quickly and can even help improve potential outcomes. These clinics can also reduce emergency visits as well as taking some pressures off of frontline workers. Mr. Speaker, RAM clinics provide a team of specialists, healthcare providers, and counselors who work together to connect patients with the proper support channels they need. Supports like addictions medicine, mental health services, mentoring, and community programs. With the launch of this new clinic, people will receive the treatment and the supports they need to live healthier lives. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Saskatchewan Health Authority and everyone involved with launching Prince Albert's new Rapid Access to Addictions Medicine Clinic. Thank you.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Westview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, St. Paul's Hospital in Saskatoon hosted a ribbon-cutting ceremony for the new CT scanner. In partnership with the St. Paul's Hospital Foundation, our government provided $1.2 million in funding for this new CT scanner. The foundation contributed the remaining $1.2 million for this equipment, ensuring medical imaging scans are more accessible to the people of Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to express our government's sincere gratitude for the work of the St. Paul's Hospital Foundation and to the many people and organizations who generously helped to make this new CT scanner a reality. Mr. Speaker, strong community support helps to ensure the healthcare system is able to provide specialized services in centres across Saskatchewan. The new CT scanner will allow healthcare professionals to provide more scans for more patients in less time. This, in turn, Mr. Speaker, will increase efficiency practices and provide clearer scans for better diagnosis and treatment options for patients. By replacing this equipment, our government is following through on its commitment to invest in infrastructure and improve patients' access to specialized imaging services. I ask all members to join me in thanking the St. Paul's Hospital Foundation and officials once again for their generosity and partnership. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Cutknife Turtleford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Sunday, December 1st, the commercial service of Enbridge's Line 3 replacement pipeline started. This pipeline will enable incremental capacity of 100,000 barrels per day to 390,000 barrels per day once it comes into full service in the later half of 2020. Mr. Speaker, this marked the first shipment of oil through this new replacement line. The $5.3 billion Canadian portion of Line 3 was completed in October of 2019. This pipeline directly employs nearly 4,500 people, and an additional 3,300 people are employed indirectly. It is also important to note, Mr. Speaker, that more than 20% of those employed are Indigenous. The Line 3 upgrade comes just in time as our oil and gas industry is grasping for more capacity to export product and freeing up rail service. And this upgrade will help to generate a labour income of $653 million for the province. Mr. Speaker, during the design and construction phases, the pipeline replacement generated over $1 billion in GDP contributions and garnered over $183 million in taxation revenue for the province of Saskatchewan. Here is the interesting thing, Mr. Speaker. All of these economic benefits can be directly attributed to the benefits of a pipeline, something the members opposite seem to oppose wholeheartedly. But on this side of the House, we continue to stand up for Saskatchewan energy sector, and we will continue to stand up for Saskatchewan economy. I ask all members to congratulate Enbridge on the completion of this replacement project.
question period. Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Access to international markets and a stable democracy are absolutely key to Western Canada's economy. This last week, Calgary lost a chance to attract a major tech company to that city because of concerns about the Wexit movement. This Western separatist movement damages our international reputation, endangering our ability to attract investment and to access international markets at a time when that's so important, at a time when producers are receiving low prices for canola because of lack of access to international markets. Mr. Speaker, why did the Premier flirt with this dangerous and foolish idea of Western separatism? Why did it take him an entire month to come to the obvious conclusion that there's no opportunity at this or at any point for Saskatchewan in breaking up Canada?
I recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, just home early this morning, actually, I was very pleased to chair a meeting of Canada's 13 premiers, Mr. Speaker, an unprecedented meeting where the Canada's 13 premiers came together to come to consensus on a number of points, Mr. Speaker. A number of points, including the economic competitiveness, pardon me, Mr. Speaker, of our nation, and that includes the economic competitiveness of the industries that are operating and creating wealth in this province, industries like the energy industry, industries like the mining industry, our agriculture industry, our manufacturing industry, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that we can continue to attract investment into our communities, to provide jobs, Mr. Speaker, not only for the people that are living in those communities today, but to provide jobs for people that want to live in those communities into the future as we grow those communities, Mr. Speaker. I was proud to chair that meeting, an unprecedented meeting where all premiers came together, not just on behalf of the people in their respective jurisdictions, but on behalf of all Canadians in general.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the response, I can't call it an answer, the Premier failed to explain why he spent an entire month adding fuel to the fire of the foolish and dangerous notion of splitting Saskatchewan away from Canada.
Hear, hear. Hear, hear. Recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I will always stand up for the people and the interests in the province of Saskatchewan within our great nation. Mr. Speaker, to ensure that we can continue to attract investment into our communities, to ensure that we can advocate for our markets that we so very need, Mr. Speaker, around the world now, selling goods into 150 countries around the world. That's why we are opening up international trade offices, so that we can continue to preserve our market access in the agriculture industry, Mr. Speaker, in the mining industry. Mr. Speaker, I will always stand up for each and every person in the province of Saskatchewan. I'd ask the member opposite why he spent 2 weeks in here, Mr. Speaker, saying why he wouldn't stand up for the people and go to a rally across this town just last year, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's shocking to hear a Premier who will only speak up for Canadian unity when absolutely pressed. This is not a priority for him at all, Mr. Speaker. It's embarrassing, Mr. Speaker. And you know what, Mr. Speaker, last week I had a chance to visit with farmers in Lipton, an area who've had a very difficult harvest. 30 to 40% of the crop still in the field after a very wet fall and summer. It was heartbreaking. It was heartbreaking to see field after field of swath still under snow, knowing the extreme stress that puts on farm families, Mr. Speaker. The RM of Lipton, in a letter sent to the Premier, along with the Minister of Agriculture and myself, they have declared their municipality an agriculture disaster area. They've got no answer from the Premier, no answer from this government, so today they're here asking for help from provincial and federal leaders. The Premier has tools available to him today to help farmers in this region. He could start by requesting that an assessment of a disaster event be initiated, which could lead to farmers receiving support under the Federal Agri-Recovery Program. So my question to the Premier, Will he show his support for farmers in the Lipton and Kelross area? Will he initiate the process to get agri-recovery available for those farmers?
Recognize the Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for the question. As a farmer myself, I've obviously understand what farmers are going through this fall, as we did the same on our farm and as many farmers are in this province. A fall that we've never experienced before, Mr. Speaker. There is still an estimated 2.5 million acres unharvested throughout the province, Mr. Speaker, and I know in some parts of the province harvest is still going on. Mr. Speaker, I'm very confident in the programs we have in place. We have the best crop insurance program that this province has ever seen. We've almost doubled the coverage, per acre coverage that was under the former government, Mr. Speaker, and we have agri-stability is there to address the concerns as well. I know there's a lot of farmers who are under stress this year, Mr. Speaker. I encourage them to reach out to the farm stress line. There's always somebody that's willing to listen, Mr. Speaker. As I said, crop insurance is there that not only looks at yield loss, but also looks at quality loss too, Mr. Speaker. So it's important that, that the farmers engage with crop insurance and have that discussion with those. This government will always support farmers in Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Premier couldn't stand up for Canadian unity, and he couldn't stand up and answer a clear question on agri-recovery. Straightforward question. The minister didn't have an answer for us either, Mr. Speaker. That's extremely disappointing. In 2013, we should get that agri-recovery process started right away. That's a simple answer. The second question is, in 2013, Prime Minister Stephen Harper, he changed the agri-stability program, dropping the eligibility level from 85% of program level down to 70%, Mr. Speaker, essentially rendering the vast majority of producers ineligible at the time when they need that support the most. As the Agricultural Producers Association of Saskatchewan, APAS, has made very clear, those changes have resulted in inadequate protection for producers. Along with our call to rebate the carbon price on the cost of grain drying, we're joining with APAS to call on the federal and provincial governments to restore agri-stability to its historic eligibility level of 85%. Will the Premier take his feet today? Will he join us in that call today? Will he help farmers in Lipton, Kelross and area fight to restore that 85% for this year and for years to come?
Hear, hear.
Recognize the Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I've said earlier in my earlier answer, Mr. Speaker, we're very confident in the programs we have in place right now for crop insurance, Mr. Speaker. We also are the only province that compensates 100% for wildlife damage to crops that are still in the fields, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on questions of agri-stability, one thing this government has always done is engaged with the farm groups on discussion around changes to business risk management tools, Mr. Speaker. Those are discussions that we as a province have taken to the federal minister, have taken to the FPT table, Mr. Speaker, and there will be discussions later on this month at the FPT table just in regards to changes to the agri-stability program, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, the farm stress line is not the answer. These folks are here today because they need real support from this government. Yesterday, the Minister of Health suggested that the physician shortage in Regina emergency rooms was a short-term issue that had already been resolved. Unfortunately for the people of this province, this just isn't true, and we know the shortage isn't just in Regina. Today, we're highlighting high numbers that make it clear that Saskatchewan has fewer doctors than almost everywhere in the country. What's the minister's plan to address the doctor shortage impacting communities in every corner of our province?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, to correct the record, I didn't indicate that it was a short-term situation, Mr. Speaker. What I said in the House and in the scrum I believe, was that last spring, early in the spring, that under the Murray formula, that the shortage was said to be 4.6 emergency room doctors in Regina. Subsequently, 3 doctors were hired, and according to the briefing note that the Leader of the Opposition brought out as one more smoking gun, even in the memo, Mr. Speaker, it says there still remains a shortage of 1.6 FTEs. Mr. Speaker, I very clearly had said that in the scrum yesterday. Mr. Speaker, as far as physician recruitment, absolutely we understand that it's an ongoing issue. For some specialties, Mr. Speaker, for areas of rural Saskatchewan, it continues to be difficult, but Mr. Speaker, the Physician Recruitment Agency over the last decade has had a great deal of success in different areas. Mr. Speaker, we have 900 more doctors in Saskatchewan than we did when we were given the privilege of forming government.
As a member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government loves to talk about what's happening right now by using the benchmark of 2007. And they don't want to talk about what's been happening in the last few years because they don't want to draw attention to that. But I have to correct the minister. He's mistaken. There have been no emergency doctors hired in Regina since that letter was shared. So I'd ask him to check his facts. Mr. Speaker, today communities across the province are being let down by the shortage of doctors. In the last year, the communities of La Ronge, Moosomin, Meadow Lake, Porcupine Plain, Broadview, Bigger, Belcaris, Fort Capel, Lestock, Raymore, and Tisdale have all had service disruptions due to doctor shortages. And Saskatchewan doctors are burning out at alarming rates. A survey conducted by the Saskatchewan Medical Association shows this troubling trend. A full 62% of Saskatchewan doctors said they are at risk of burning out. This isn't sustainable. What's the plan to make sure Saskatchewan doctors have working conditions that will keep them helping people in their community?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And back to the briefing note that the member referred to, if I could clarify again. She said that those doctors weren't hired. Mr. Speaker, the briefing note itself says the Ministry of Health has recently increased EP funding by 3 FTEs, bringing the total funded EP staffing FTEs to 31.3. That's from the briefing note that the member opposite brought in the House yesterday. Mr. Speaker, again, we recognize the issue of doctor recruitment. The Physician Recruitment Agency has put a number of rewards in place, Mr. Speaker. There's a 10.5% premium for rural family physicians, Mr. Speaker. They've recruited across the country, in international markets as well, Mr. Speaker. We've increased the number of training seats for doctors. Mr. Speaker, we recognize it's an ongoing issue that we need to rectify, but Mr. Speaker, what you see today with 900 more physicians in the province is a far cry from when we formed government, when virtually every community in this province was short of physicians.
As a member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, the minister just proved my point. Those hires happened before the briefing note was issued. The SMA is saying the level of burnout they are seeing is concerning. And if that minister isn't concerned as well, he simply isn't paying attention. The reported level of burnout of Saskatchewan doctors is more than double national numbers. Family physicians, young doctors, and those practicing in rural areas report the highest rates of burnout. This tells us that something is wrong in Saskatchewan, and this government needs to step up and find solutions. What's the plan to recruit and retain more doctors so people are able to access appropriate care when they need it?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, we've increased the number of seats at the College of Medicine to 40, Mr. Speaker. We've doubled the number of medical residency positions from 60 to 120. And, Mr. Speaker, we continue to actively and aggressively recruit doctors from across the country and around the world, Mr. Speaker. The SIPA program has had a great deal of success, Mr. Speaker. In those cases, it guarantees community service of at least 3 years if the doctor decides not to stay. Mr. Speaker, we think that the changes we made at the College of Medicine will begin to show fruition very shortly. It took a number of years to do that, Mr. Speaker. Again, we recognize the seriousness of this. We are having the SHA is aggressively recruiting doctors, and Mr. Speaker, I would point to the results. once more, there's 900 more doctors in this province than there was when those members opposite were in government.
Here.
Recognize a member for Regina Lakeview.
The Minister of Education continues to ignore the crisis in our classrooms. And whenever I ask him about that crisis, he has one of two answers: conversations or the P3 schools foisted onto school divisions. Well, Mr. Speaker, here's what the SCC at one of those schools, Wascana Plains, has to say about the state of education under the Sass Party. Quote, Ecole Wascana Plains is experiencing critical capacity issues, both now and in the near future. There are currently over 700 students attending Ecole Wascana Plains, a school that has capacity of about 500 students, end quote. Further, the student population, Mr. Speaker, is projected to grow to over 1,000 by 2022, fully double the school's capacity. To the Minister, what is he going to do to address the overcapacity issues at Wascana Plains?
I recognize the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, I find it interesting that the member asked about Ecole Wascana Plains as a school that they vote against, Mr. Speaker, when we brought our budget forward, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, growth has its challenges, Mr. Speaker. Growth has its challenges, Mr. Speaker. We're well aware of the challenges at Wascana Plains, Mr. Speaker. That's been brought to me by the Minister of Corrections and Policing and the MLA for Regina Wascana Plains. Mr. Speaker, we've had a number of conversations. I've responded to the letter that we've received from the President of the SCC, Mr. Speaker, acknowledging that. Just yesterday, Mr. Speaker, in my meeting with my officials at the Ministry of Education, identifying this as one of our major priority items for the City of Regina, Mr. Speaker, but certainly the growth in that area of the city and other areas of the city demands some attention from this government, Mr. Speaker. That's precisely what we're going to do, Mr. Speaker. We know how to address the issue, Mr. Speaker, simply a question of timing as to when we're going to get that done.
As a member for Regina Lakeview.
Mr. Speaker, the parents and the SCC members at Ecole Wascana Plains don't care about those lines. They want to know what the minister is going to do to improve the schooling for their children. The letter from the SCC goes on, and I quote, "The open concept in the school conducive to student and staff collaboration in accordance with the current educational best practices is jeopardized. The ventilation and air exchange system is taxed as it is not designed to handle the current student and staff population," Mr. Speaker, and I end quote. Teachers, parents, students were promised a cutting-edge school, but this government instead built them a cookie-cutter P3 school that simply doesn't meet their needs. But the SCC does point to a solution, and I quote, "Most of the options to alleviate the capacity issues rest with the provincial government, the Ministry of Education, to be specific," Mr. Speaker, end quote. My question for the minister is this: what specifically will the Minister of Education do to address the overcrowding at Wascana Plains School?
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Speaker, let me just first correct the record, Mr. Speaker. There is no problem with the mechanical system at that school, Mr. Speaker. We made the inquiries as per the letter that we had received from the President of the SCC, Mr. Speaker, and we're assured that there is no problem. The mechanical system is not overtaxed, Mr. Speaker. These are good schools, Mr. Speaker, that were built, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that we can meet the needs of children, Mr. Speaker, in our growing communities, including Regina, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the answer to the question, Mr. Speaker, is we need to add some portables to the school, Mr. Speaker, and that's precisely the conversation that I had yesterday with my officials at the Ministry of Education to determine the priority and the timing of ensuring that we can get some portables on that school, Mr. Speaker. I've had this conversation with the MLA, Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Policing and Corrections, in terms of the timing of adding those classrooms, Mr. Speaker, but it's certainly a priority for the Ministry of Education to ensure that those portable classrooms are added as quickly as possible.
As a member for Saskatoon Riversdale.
Mr. Speaker, a report was published this week on the state of long-term care in our province. The report is titled "Crumbling Away." Spoiler alert, Long-term care facilities are crumbling, Mr. Speaker. The proportion of Saskatchewan residents over 65 is growing faster than the general population, yet the number of long-term care spaces is decreasing. Conservative estimates say Saskatchewan will require 4,500 more long-term care beds by 2035. I'm glad they're so engaged in this conversation, Mr. Speaker. This government loves to talk about growth, but isn't up to the job when it comes to providing the services that people need to support that growth. When will the Sask Party ensure that there are enough long-term care beds for people in our province?
Recognize the Minister of Rural and Remote Health.
Mr. Speaker, as our aging population increases, our government will continue to address the need for more long-term care spaces and supports for our residents. Mr. Speaker, we have added over 700 more frontline staff since 2007. Mr. Speaker, our annual funding to long-term care has increased 45% to over $744 million in 2018-2019, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, our most recent resident and family experiences survey, conducted in 2018-19, confirms that the high level of care has been confirmed by over 85% of the residents confirming the satisfaction that they have with the care that they've received, Mr. Speaker. The families of these members has been a very close percentage, has indicated the same, Mr. Speaker. We'll continue to work hard to be able to provide the appropriate level of care that's required to meet the aging requirements of our population, Mr. Speaker.
As a member of Saskatoon Riversdale.
Continue to provide the right level of care, Mr. Speaker. Clearly that member hasn't been in a long-term care facility in a very long time. In Regina, almost half of the 390 beds in Pioneer Village have closed as mold problems continue to plague the facility. Grenfell Pioneer Home has been completely shuttered. What we desire for ourselves, Mr. Speaker, we wish for all. Everyone living in a long-term care facility deserves the dignity of a safe, comfortable home with an appropriate level of care, which is not the case for so many. The Crumbling Away report shows this government has done little to assure either quantity or quality of long-term care spaces for some of the province's most vulnerable citizens. To the Minister, what is the plan for fixing our crumbling, under-resourced long-term care facilities?
As the Minister of Rural and Remote Health.
Mr. Speaker, long-term care is definitely a key priority for this government. I was as early as Saturday in a long-term care facility in my constituency, Mr. Speaker. Well, the care and concern that was provided, second to none, Mr. Speaker, is what we heard from the residents that were in that care facility. Mr. Speaker, we have the second highest number of beds per aging population across the country, Mr. Speaker, a close second to Manitoba. Mr. Speaker, we're going to continue to work hard to meet the needs of our residents, our senior residents, as they age in this province, Mr. Speaker.
As a member for Saskatoon-Newtana.
Mr. Speaker, last week I asked the minister to commit that the CEO of Westcap Management would come to the next CCA meeting to answer questions about his company, how his company managed our public money. Now, the minister said he'd be very happy to answer those questions, so I'll try asking a few here right now, Mr. Speaker. First of all, did Westcap come to First Nations with investment ideas, or did the First Nations come to Westcap? Secondly, how did Westcap assemble the list of companies that they encouraged the FNMS recipients to invest in? Thirdly, why didn't the minister answer any of these questions?
Order. Can't hear the question. Continue.
Didn't the minister answer any questions in the House on Monday then? What is the government of Westcap doing to recover the money that's been lost so far? And why did Westcap sometimes purchase a minority stake when the program stated only majority stakes would be accepted?
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Another day, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, another day, another attempt to drive-by smear of respected businessmen in the city of Saskatoon. Mr. Speaker, here's the facts, Mr. Speaker. This fund was created in 2005 under the former NDP government, Mr. Speaker, and it's sole sourced to Westcap, Mr. Speaker. No RFP, Mr. Speaker. Apparently, at the time, When they were in government, Mr. Speaker, they had full confidence, Mr. Speaker, in Westcap to manage this, Mr. Speaker. They were a respected, professional manager, Mr. Speaker, with a diversified portfolio, Mr. Speaker, to remind the New Democrats, Mr. Speaker, that they were designed by the NDP, Mr. Speaker, with a mandate to help First Nations and Métis people to move forward with economic development initiatives, Mr. Speaker, at a time, Mr. Speaker, when those companies didn't have access to traditional capital, Mr. Speaker. The New Democrats, at the time when they put the plan together, and we applaud them for it, Mr. Speaker, it was forward-thinking. But, Mr. Speaker, there's a natural risk, Mr. Speaker, with these investments, Mr. Speaker, and certainly after the headwinds that the economy faced, Mr. Speaker, a number of those investments didn't succeed, Mr. Speaker. But the intent of the fund, Mr. Speaker, was an attempt to give a hand up, Mr. Speaker, to First Nations and Métis companies, Mr. Speaker, the expectation of the New Democrats when they put it together, Mr. Speaker, which we endorsed.
As a member for Saskatoon-Newtana.
Speaker, it's a sad day in this House when the Deputy Premier puts honest questions on the same level as a drive-by smear. He should be ashamed, Mr. Speaker. These are honest questions. Now, Mr. Speaker, it wasn't that long ago that Brad Wall, Bill Boyd, and everyone else in the Sask Party was holding up GTech as a shining example of success at the GTH. Wall told us all, quote, taxpayers are making money. The Minister for Trade and Export Development said, quote, I think this is going to be a very positive project for the city and for the entire province, end quote. How times have changed, Mr. Speaker. Things have gone off the rails so badly at the GTEC that they're taking out two-page ads in the Leader Post to attack journalists and to argue that everything's fine. It's clear to anyone who's been following that everything at the GTEC and the GTH is not fine. So how much worse do things at the GTH need to get before this government will finally accept some responsibility for the fact that Bill Boyd's pipe dream has turned into a total gong show?
Recognize the Minister of Trade and Exports.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I heard a number of different issues raised in regard to that question, but one of them had to do with the provincial nominee program. And, Mr. Speaker, I can tell you that we have one of the very best and most respected provincial nominee programs in the entire country, Mr. Speaker. A program that's been largely responsible for the largest period of population growth we have seen since the 1920s and 30s in this province, Mr. Speaker, in stark contrast with what we saw during their time in government, Mr. Speaker, which was an exodus of young people looking for opportunity elsewhere. Mr. Speaker, I have an announcement coming up right after question period. The members, I know, are looking forward to it on further changes to the provincial nominee program, one of the very best in Canada.
Well, with that preamble, ministerial statements. Recognize the Minister of Trade and Exports.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and the House did not have to wait long to get here. But I am very proud today to rise, Mr. Speaker, to inform the House about an expansion of the Saskatchewan Immigrant Nominee Program. A significant proportion of Saskatchewan's historic population growth has come from international immigration. More recently, the number of new Canadians who arrived in our province through the SIMP has grown from just under 2,000 people in 2007 to over 11,000 people in 2018. Our government recently released the new growth plan with a goal to grow our province's population to 1.4 million by 2030. One of the 20 actions outlined in the growth plan is to grow our population by keeping more young people in our province, as well as increasing immigration. Mr. Speaker, we have an opportunity to not only retain skilled international students with an entrepreneurial focus, but also to attract new students. That's why earlier today, along with the Minister of Advanced Education, I was proud to announce a new immigration program category in the Saskatchewan Immigrant Nominee Program. The new International Graduate Entrepreneur category is an accessible avenue for international students to immigrate and stay permanently in Saskatchewan if they are entrepreneurs. It's for applicants who have completed a full-time post-secondary degree or diploma of at least 2 years in length from a designated learning institution in Saskatchewan. This designation allows those applicants to obtain a federal post-graduation work permit and operate their business. To qualify, they must actively operate and manage a business in the province for a minimum of 1 year and own at least 1/3 of an eligible business in order to be nominated for permanent residency. Mr. Speaker, this new category creates a means to help retain those international students who have already chosen to come and study in our province, and also attract those who are considering Saskatchewan as a place to study. In addition to growing our population, retaining skilled entrepreneurial students, and attracting new international students, this new category has a number of other benefits. The category will also assist in the creation of new businesses and jobs in communities across Saskatchewan. This will help achieve the Growth Plan goal to create 100,000 more jobs by 2030. This initiative will also support our province's international education strategy. By creating and marketing this category, it will increase the international profile of our post-secondary institutions and support their recruitment strategies. And finally, this new category will encourage innovation and entrepreneurship within the post-secondary environment and the province as a whole. Mr. Speaker, we're building upon the growth and success of the Saskatchewan Immigrant Nominee Program. This will help to build strong communities, a strong economy, and a strong Saskatchewan. Thank you very much.
As a member for Regina Rosemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate having the statement from the minister in advance of coming into the House here today. Certainly, the SINP program is a very important program, an important tool to grow Saskatchewan. Newcomers, new Canadians come from all around the world to help build Saskatchewan and all facets of our province. Certainly, economic strength is one of the things that they offer, Mr. Speaker, but they build and shape a bright future in this province, and that's so incredibly important, Mr. Speaker. The program being announced here today, will be looking for some more detail. It seems very focused on entrepreneurs alone. Entrepreneurs are very important, and there's so many newcomers, new Canadians as entrepreneurs that help build our economy. But it seems that that might be a bit of a narrow focus, because certainly there's so many graduates across disciplines that are ready to serve and build Saskatchewan and build our economy and deliver services. Some of those individuals might not fit the entrepreneur class itself, Mr. Speaker. It's also incumbent on us, for us to meet our population goals, for us to retain those that are choosing to build and better their lives, thus building and bettering Saskatchewan. It's incumbent on us to make sure that the services are in place that they count on. High-quality education, Mr. Speaker, high-quality health services, a vibrant and strong economy, and of course, I won't get into these matters too far, but we have some serious concerns with the direction that the Sask Party government is taking us on these fronts. The hurt in our classrooms, the inadequate support for emergency and health services, and a weakened economy, often because of the choices of this government. And certainly it's critical for all, Mr. Speaker, certainly newcomers and entrepreneurs and all within this province, to build a strong economy. We also need to make sure that the SINP program and any immigration program has integrity to it, that it's not being exploited, Mr. Speaker. There are some serious concerns that have been identified. Certainly we need to make sure that government's providing the oversight and action to make sure the integrity of these important systems. And just in closing, Mr. Speaker, the one class of immigration that has really been shut down in Saskatchewan, that's so important to the new Canadians that I speak to, is that of the family class. And the family class is so important for new Canadians to be able to have family join them. It's critical for them. So I'll stop here for a moment while the Minister of Immigration astoundingly wants to heckle about the family class, which is so important to new Canadians across Saskatchewan. You want to keep heckling, sort of chirping from your seat? You know, he's got his bow tie and a knot, Mr. Speaker, but I think if he sat down with new Canadians, Mr. Speaker, with those that are building and bettering Saskatchewan, he would learn about the importance of the family class and what that means for us to retain those that are choosing to build and better their lives here in Saskatchewan, building and bettering our province, Mr. Speaker, and I expect a lot better. It doesn't surprise me, sadly, these days that this is the approach of the Sask Party government, but that family class of immigration is very important to retaining new Canadians, to newcomers, and it's very, very important to their families and their quality of life, Mr. Speaker. With that being said, surprised to be heckled on such an important point, Mr. Speaker, but certainly this is an expansion of an important program, and we'll enter in coming days. Thank you.
Hear, hear.
A little too personal. Introduction of bills.
Item number 1, Honourable Mr. Morgan.
Recognize the Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that Bill number 205, the Children's Law Act 2019, a bilingual bill, be now introduced and read a first time.
It's moved by the Minister that Bill number 205 be now introduced and read a first time. Pleasure the Assembly to adopt the motion. Anybody agree to it? Agreed. Carried.
First reading of this bill.
And shall this bill be read a second time? Recognize the Minister.
Next sitting of the Assembly, Mr. Speaker.
Next sitting.
Item number 2, Honourable Mr. Morgan.
Recognize the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill number 206, the Children's Law Consequential Amendments Act 2019, be now introduced and read a first time.
It's been moved by the Minister that Bill number 206 be now introduced and read a first time. Pleasure the Assembly to adopt the motion. Agreed. Carried.
First reading of this bill.
And shall this bill be read a second time? Recognize the Minister.
Sitting of the Assembly, Mr. Speaker.
Next sitting. Presenting reports by standing and special committees. Orders of the day.
Government orders, second reading, item number 1, Bill number 203, the Financial Planner and Financial Advisors Act. Honourable Mr. Morgan.
Recognize Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to move second reading of the Financial Planners and Financial Advisors Act. Mr. Speaker, this legislation will protect consumers and investors by ensuring that persons acting as financial planners and financial advisors have the credentials and education required to provide those services. Regulating these titles will recognize the significant knowledge and skills of financial planners and financial advisors and will ensure that these titles are only used by qualified individuals. Mr. Speaker, this legislation is modeled on Ontario's Financial Professionals Title Protection Act 2019. It also includes additional sections to ensure consistency with other Saskatchewan legislation and to support effective enforcement by the Financial Consumer Affairs Authority. The legislation will regulate 2 titles, Financial Planner and Financial Advisor. The Financial Consumer Affairs Authority will approve credentialing bodies and will approve the credentials offered by those credentialing bodies. The legislation also provides the Financial Consumer Affairs Authority with a full suite of enforcement powers similar to those powers in other acts administered by the authority. Mr. Speaker, this bill is the first step in regulating these titles in Saskatchewan. As with the Ontario Act, many of the details of the legislation will be set out in the regulations, including the specific requirements for approving credentialing bodies and approved credentials. The regulations will be developed in consultation with industry. The regulations will also be made consistent with Ontario's regulations as much as is possible to support national consistency. Mr. Speaker, the legislation will provide important protection to consumers and investors and promote consumer confidence in financial planners and advisors in this province. Mr. Speaker, it's my privilege to move second reading of the Financial Planners and Financial Advisors Act.
It has been moved that Bill number 203 be now read a second time. Assembly ready for the question. Recognize the member for Athabasca.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud again to once again take my place to give the first response to some of the legislative agenda of the Saskatchewan Party. And Bill number 203, the Financial Planners and Financial Advisors Act 2019. Mr. Speaker, is a very important bill that many people need to pay attention. As you know, Mr. Speaker, there are many people out there that self-profess to be financial advisors, and many people do it in many walks of life. And it's very important to know in this day and age with the technology that's out there, and certainly the fact that there's a lot more communication between people. There's numerous ways to communicate with many of the people that may be impacted by assertions that certain people are financial planners. Mr. Speaker, who is protecting the general public? Who's protecting the elderly? Who's protecting the people that need to know that if they do get approached by a financial planner, that this individual is certainly a legitimate person, that he or she certainly has the skill set to be able to tell people that they are a professional financial planner. So what this bill does, Mr. Speaker, it sets out the definitions of a financial planner and a financial advisor and other terms to be used under the legislation. It provides for the requirement of a credentialing body to assess the credentials and the education of financial planners and advisors. It authorizes the Financial and Consumer Affairs Authority to approve the credentialing bodies and other credentials offered through these institutions, sets out the conditions for suspension and revocation of the credentialing bodies, sets out the duties and powers of the credentialing bodies, sets out the procedures for inspection and investigation of the activities of financial planners and advisors, and of course, Mr. Speaker, provides the administrative penalties to be observed under the legislation. It is so very important, Mr. Speaker, that as you look at the global world, as we often hear reference to, and the connectiveness of many people and countries nowadays, Mr. Speaker, to be very careful of entering into agreements or arrangements with people who profess to be of a certain skill set, and those that, as we often hear, some of the potential scams that may be going on, not only across the country, but in our own backyards, Mr. Speaker, from people who profess to have certain skill sets, but really are not certified or qualified in any way, shape, or form to be able to claim certain authority, especially when it comes to financial planning and financial advice, Mr. Speaker. So a lot of people need to find out exactly what the legislation does. I think it's paramount to talking to the institutions that are impacted, whether they're banking or other lending institutions, as to how they approach their clients. What is really important, Mr. Speaker, is that when people come to your home or give you a call or send you a letter saying that they're a financial planner, that there is a very easy contact number or an on-site service that you can access to actually check on the credentials of this particular individual, and that there'd be associations and there'd be penalties, there'd be ways and means of qualifying this individual's declaration that they are a professional financial planner or advisor. So, Mr. Speaker, again, as I pointed out, it is very important to get those professional people or access to the professional people, and that is something that people have on many occasions have done. And as I said before, there are many institutions that have employed professionally trained financial planners and advisors. So there are many people out there, but there are some that claim to be and don't have the proper authority, nor do they have the proper credentials, nor do they have the proper training. So I think it's important that we make sure that the definitions in the legislation are clear and that the credential process is clear and that there's oversight on this particular industry, and that will require, of course, a bit more thought, a bit more time, and certainly we need to study the Act itself to ensure that what is being proposed here meets the obligation of protecting the people of Saskatchewan, especially those that are vulnerable, elderly, and those that may not be aware of some of the requirements to be calling yourself a financial planner. So much work needs to be done, and based on that particular premise, Mr. Speaker, I move that we adjourn debate on Bill 203, the Financial Planners and Financial Advisors Act 2019.
Members move to adjourn debate. Pleasure Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government Orders second reading, item number 2. Second reading on Bill number 204, the Juries Amendment Act 2019. Honourable Mr. Morgan.
Recognize the Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to move second reading of the Jury Amendment Act 2019. This legislation amends the Jury Act 1998 to improve and modernize the jury selection process and to encourage increased juror participation. The amendments are the result of a multi-year review of the jury management system. Mr. Speaker, these amendments will make the jury selection process more efficient and help make juries as representative as possible. The current two-draw process will be replaced with one targeted draw. As part of this process, the Inspector of Court offices will have the ability to determine the specific geographical area from which to summon jurors for a particular trial. Targeting specific areas will allow us to better take travel time for jurors into account. By making it easier for jurors to attend proceedings, we hope to improve jury participation and representation. The amendments will also revise the grounds for exclusion from jury service. Chiefs and council members of Indian bands will now be excluded from jury service, similar to the current exclusion for municipal council members. Mr. Speaker, the Act currently provides that when certain persons are excluded from jury service, their spouses are excluded as well, which in smaller centres means a smaller pool of eligible prospective jurors. The amendments will remove the current exclusion for spouses of reeves, councillors, mayors, coroners, and school board members, which will allow for increased juror eligibility and participation. Mr. Speaker, these amendments will also provide increased protection of the personal information of jurors and prospective jurors. This information will no longer be part of the public record, but will now only be available to parties to a proceeding and under any terms and conditions imposed by the court. A new option to conduct the jury impaneling process electronically is also included as part of these amendments. This would involve random selection done by computer rather than by hand. This option may not be exercised right away, but building it into the Act now provides the flexibility to adopt an electronic system in the future. Finally, there are several other amendments proposed for housekeeping and improved administrative efficiency. A number of amendments are also being made to the French version only to improve the translation. Mr. Speaker, serving as a juror is an important civic duty. These amendments will ensure that Saskatchewan's jury management system uses modern processes that will support jurors in this essential role. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to move second reading of the Jury Amendment Act 2019.
It has been moved that Bill number 204 be now read a second time. Assembly ready for the question. Recognize the member for Athabasca.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It gives me a great pleasure to join in the debate as it pertains to Bill 204, the Jury Amendment Act 2019. Now, Mr. Speaker, there's been a number of media stories as it pertains to this particular bill. And certainly we've read some of the information, and we've talked at great length to a number of people that are part and parcel of the whole justice system rollout. And Mr. Speaker, as I've alluded to on the numerous occasions within this Assembly, that we've had a number of very capable lawyers within our caucus that are able to shift through all the language and certainly are aware of some of the casework that involves matters around jury selection, and there, of course, would be more proficient and certainly much more thoughtful as to how the process could be improved here in Saskatchewan, and certainly I would defer to them on that particular front. What I want to spend my time as it pertains to the Jury Amendment Act 2019, Mr. Speaker, is that the Act itself makes changes to juror selection and summoning processes, and also excludes chiefs and council members of Indian bands from service as jurors, and then it allows spouses of reeves, mayors, city councils to serve as jurors, excludes persons that have been sentenced to 2 or more years and have not been pardoned for services as jurors, and authorizes the electronic impaneling of a jury. Now, Mr. Speaker, these are issues that need a hard look at within our justice system, as every aspect of the justice system needs to have a reflection at any point in time to see exactly how the system is fair and just for all. And that's exactly the point that I want to spend a few moments on, if I may, in the sense of the bill itself, where we're talking about the Jury Amendment Act. And, Mr. Speaker, it's very important to point out to the people of Saskatchewan, who I believe are just people, who are fair people, and have consistently throughout time from all walks of life have always asked for a system, a justice system that is fair, impartial, and to the point. And I think, Mr. Speaker, as you look throughout history, the whole notion of respect for one another and for the processes of each other is something that is very, very key in settling the country. And as we've said time and time again, between the Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in particular, again, from my perspective, it is important that respect be reciprocated, in the sense that we are able to sit down and talk about issues that impact and affect the system that have been brought forward to the Indigenous people by the non-Indigenous people, and vice versa as well, Mr. Speaker. I think there's many things that need to be looked at. The jury selection, I think, is one of the issues that many people have spoken to me about, that it's got to be reflective, I think, overall of our provincial cultural makeup, if you will, or of our ethnic backgrounds. I think there's some very compelling arguments that that be something that is also fair. Anything that's unconstitutional and that demeans a certain individual, a certain group of people's rights to be participatory in any parts of the judiciary system, Mr. Speaker, is patently unfair, and that needs to be addressed. And I think from the perspective of the Jury Amendment Act, I think there's recognition of the fact that there has been some issues that needed resolving, and this is one of the areas, I think, Mr. Speaker, that there is so many hard lessons learned as to how the jury's selection process works in the province of Saskatchewan. And I bumped into it a few times as an MLA from people in northern Saskatchewan that are elderly, that cannot afford to travel, Mr. Speaker, that many times their primary language is Cree, and then they get a jury summons in the mail, and it makes it very, very difficult for them to make the trip, and oftentimes we assist them with the forms to advise the Justice Department that they're unable to make the trip due to their age, due to a medical condition, due to the distance, due to the fact that they don't have access to a vehicle. There's a number of factors that will allow you to be exempt from jury selection, Mr. Speaker, and as I've identified, there are a number of issues that the northern people face when given the possibility of being part of a jury. That being said, Mr. Speaker, efforts must be made to incorporate the Indigenous community in as many aspects of the legal system as possible. We have been blessed with many lawyers that have come from the Indigenous communities, and there are many very accomplished lawyers. We have had judges that have been part of the makeup of the judiciary in terms of the high-ranking members of the justice system overall. So it's nice to be able to see lawyers involved with the justice system that are Indigenous, and of course the judges as well. The last piece, when it comes to jury selection, Mr. Speaker, I think it's only fair that we examine all aspects of the justice system to make sure it's fair and balanced and representative of all people, and that's one of the most important lessons I think we've learned over the last number of years. And certainly, Mr. Speaker, there's going to be more said on this process as we embark on this legislation, because it does bring about some really tough questions for all of us to ponder as we look at the review of the justice system overall, because, Mr. Speaker, that system must be fair to absolutely everyone. And I pointed out from time to time to many people in my travels that if you look at the comparisons between the Manitoba model and the Saskatchewan model, as opposed to the generally the same population base as two prairie provinces, Mr. Speaker, and roughly the same concentration of Indigenous people within those two provinces, Mr. Speaker, it is amazingly similar. The incarceration rates and the population, inmate population, and the incarceration rates of both those particular provinces are very, very similar when it comes to the Indigenous population overall. So we can see that there are some significant gaps in terms of how to prevent crime and how to correct some of the challenges within our justice system. Because as you see, one particular group being overrepresented in our jail system, Mr. Speaker, does that beg the question that is there issues there that are unfair within our justice system? Well, that's the question that needs to be asked, Mr. Speaker. And as we look at all aspects of the justice system overall, whether it is lawyers or whether it's judges or whether it's a simple fact of the jury selection process, there must be refinements made throughout that system, Mr. Speaker. At the same time, there must be concentrated efforts to try and reduce crime, and much of the crime within all communities, including the Indigenous communities, Mr. Speaker, can be prevented and lessened if we address the root cause, which is poverty and services, and to reclaim families. So it is a wide open effort when we talk about justice for all. It just doesn't mean the court system. It doesn't mean just the jury selection. It really means it's a human, economic, and justice matter, and we need to incorporate some of those thoughts as we embark on this journey. Much more needs to be said about this process. Much more needs to be said about the Jury Amendment Act, Mr. Speaker, and I'm positive that those that are greater legal minds than myself and perhaps yourself, Mr. Speaker, they would have a lot more to say on this particular bill. So I move that we adjourn debate on Bill 204, the Jury Amendment Act 2019.
Members move to adjourn debate. Pleasure assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders adjourned debates. Item number 1, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 175, the Marriage Amendment Act 2019. Ms. Chartier.
And as a member for John and Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my honor to rise today and enter into the debate around Bill number 175, the Marriage Amendment Act. Mr. Speaker, I've actually already had the opportunity to speak to this bill, and I gave my remarks and concerns about some of the changes in the bill, as well as some of the language that remains in the bill in my earlier remarks, so I won't repeat that again. If anyone's reviewing Hansard, I urge them to look at my remarks from another day, which we know there are many people who review Hansard, Mr. Speaker. At this point, I am prepared to allow this bill to move on to its next stage.
Question before Assembly is a motion by the Minister that Bill number 175 be now read a second time. Pleasure Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Second reading of this bill.
To which committee shall this bill be committed? I recognize the Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I designate that Bill number 175, the Marriage Amendment Act 2019, be committed to the Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
This bill stands committed to the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Government orders adjourned debates. Item number 2, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 181, the Mineral Taxation Modernization Amendment Act. Ms. Beck.
As a member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to enter into debate today on Bill number 181, the Mineral Taxation Modernization Amendment Act of 2019. I will be brief, but I do think it's important that we get some comments on the record here, Mr. Speaker. There are some changes that are being proposed in this bill. Some of those are introducing the electronic management system, EMS, to administer mineral tax rights, adding the new definition for the EMS electronic signature, changing the way the area of mineral titles is determined, and the procedures regarding the extent of ownership of mineral title. It removes the clause regarding the payment of $960 per nominal section of the area owned by the mineral rights holder. Determines that the owner of the mineral rights will pay a tax calculated at a prescribed rate. So we look forward to regulations to see what that looks like. It changes the procedures around the transfer of mineral rights and changes the procedures applicable to unpaid mineral right taxes. We know that a bill with the same name was introduced this past spring, so we'll be asking some questions to find out why they had to reintroduce the same legislation and what changes occurred between April and now. There are a lot of implications in this bill with regards to changes in the ownership of a mineral title, the area of mineral titles, and the tax rate. So this will be something we'll be looking into quite a bit. And there's a lot of uncertainties and unknowns in the legislation. And it seems to create uncertainty rather than being precise. It's important that owners of mineral rights know exactly what kind of rights they have before they decide how to exercise those rights to their mineral titles. So we'll be looking into this legislation quite closely, and I know the critic will have a number of questions once it advances to its next stages. But with that, I would move to adjourn debate on this bill for today.
Members move to adjourn debate. Pleasure assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders adjourned debates. Item number 3, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 183, the Fisheries Saskatchewan Act 2019. Mr. Vermette.
Recognize the member for John Elphinstone Centre.
Hey, thanks very much, Mr. Speaker. Good to take my place, join debate on Bill number 183, the Fisheries Saskatchewan Act 2019. Mr. Speaker, I think it's appropriate to start off my remarks by putting a bit of a question to members opposite as to whether or not, by my reading of this bill, it would seem to have the fingerprints of the member from the Battlefords all over it. I don't know if this is like a legacy bill or a wholly owned subsidiary of the member from the Battlefords, but certainly when most of us heard the words quagga mussel for the first time, Mr. Speaker, we all, went to the dictionary, but we should have just gone to the member from the Battlefords and asked him, what's up? Because that was an individual who had looked beyond the horizon, was, up on the events of the day, and commenced a public awareness campaign and an enforcement campaign, the likes of which I've never seen on anything related to mussels before or since, Mr. Speaker. So that the Fisheries Act is now renovated, reborn, some might say, Mr. Speaker, and has a lot more room in it for taking on the invasive aquatic species, Mr. Speaker, and such as the quagga mussel. Mr. Speaker, I think we owe a debt of gratitude to the member from the Battlefords, and I know I might sound a little snarky sometimes in this place, Mr. Speaker, but in all seriousness, I extend my gratitude to the member from Battlefords and the way that good hard work is borne forth in this legislation here today, Mr. Speaker. I can only hope if, as they're assembling the advisory committees that are envisioned in this legislation, that I don't know if it's a role for a fisheries czar fisheries lieutenant colonel, that they might see a place to keep that momentum going, to keep that good work on offer for the people of Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker. And again, I just want to get that on the record right off the top here. You know, some say maybe his fingerprints are all over this legislation. Some might say it's got the dents of a deftly wielded fish bat, Mr. Speaker. Anyway, job well done, and credit where credit is due. But certainly, Mr. Speaker, that this legislation is coming around for a renovation or a revisit or a review. It's been a while since 1994, Mr. Speaker. I know for both of us, that's been a while. You know, when you think about how the time passes for a piece of legislation like this, well, it's quite a long while, Mr. Speaker. So that they've revisited the Fisheries Act, Saskatchewan 1994, with this updating, only makes sense, and we'll be interested to see, Mr. Speaker. And again, I was asking my colleague, the member from Rosemont, whether or not he gave it a thumbs up or a thumbs down, and then it looked like he was making some kind of a casting motion, Mr. Speaker. But, you know, I take that as approval and, you know, enthusiastically delivered. And that means a lot to me because, you know, when it comes to matters fishery related, that's my first stop right there. Quagga mussels, first stop is the Balfords. Invasive aquatic species, first stop is the Balfords. But when it comes to fishery matters, generally, Mr. Speaker, I'm looking to Rosemont for the high sign. So, Mr. Speaker, in terms of the legislation itself, there's some changes to definitions. There are some powers that are authorized for the minister. And again, we'll see how the minister, you know, utilizes these powers in terms of designating fishery officers, in terms of appointing advisory committees. And again, it might be too early for nominations, but again, I'm looking, Balfords, I'm looking at you in terms of nominations. In terms of setting out the requirements for license in relation to native wild fish, aquatic species, in terms of changing the procedures regarding the amendment, suspension, cancellation of licenses. Again, Mr. Speaker, I don't know if my colleague from Rosemont's got a lifetime fish license, or if such a thing is even possible, but I'd maybe put him up for a nomination in that regard as well. But, Mr. Speaker, in terms of, in all seriousness, fishing is a very big deal in the province of Saskatchewan, south to north, east to west, and that we provide the appropriate regulatory oversight for that wonderful pastime and livelihood, Mr. Speaker, is critical. So, again, in terms of updating the legislation, updating the various fines and powers of the minister, as regards all matters fishery, we'll be interested to see how that plays out. There was also an undertaking made, Mr. Speaker, a mention made of consulting with Indigenous people on this legislation in terms of First Nations and Métis people, and of course the relation between fisheries and treaty and Indigenous rights, Mr. Speaker. We'll be interested to see how that work was undertaken, who was consulted with, how that measures up, Mr. Speaker, because again, sometimes the proclamations don't quite add up to the reality as it played out on the ground. But we'll hold that off for another day, Mr. Speaker, and certainly that should promise some interesting questioning at committee. Anyway, Mr. Speaker, I'm getting I don't know if they're telling me to fish or cut bait over here, but I think it's time to come to the end of this one, Mr. Speaker. And with that, I would move to adjourn debate on Bill number 183, the Fisheries Saskatchewan Act 2019.
Members move to adjourn debate. Pleasure assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Adjourn debates. Item number 4, resume debate on the second reading motion of Bill number 184, the Fisheries Saskatchewan Consequential Amendments Act 2019. Mr. Vermette.
Recognize the member for Regina Elphinstone Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And as ever, thanks to the folks who make this place go round, especially to the table and to the great folks in Journals and Hansard. It takes a village, Mr. Speaker. But certainly, Bill number 184, consequential amendments to subsequent acts, issuing forth from Bill number 183. You know, you say it a bit more slowly, and it's kind of self-evident, Mr. Speaker. So I don't know that much more needs to be said at this point. So I'd move to adjourn debate on Bill number 184.
Members move to adjourn debate. Pleasure assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Adjourn debates. Item number 5, resume debate on the second reading motion of Bill number 187, the Administration of the States Amendment Act 2019. Ms. Sharkey.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Newtana.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm rising today to enter the debate on this bill. It looks like it's a fairly pro forma kind of bill where the minister indicated that the changes in this bill to how estates are administered in Saskatchewan is reflecting amendments recommended by the Office of the Public Guardian and Trustee. Mr. Speaker, as you know, the public office of the Guardian and Trustee serves a very important function in our society in the event that folks become public trustees or their estates are by way of not having a will, last will and estate. I have to confess, Mr. Speaker, I avoided wills and estates in law school, so I'm definitely not one to speak with any great familiarity on this area.
Like a bit of a testament.
You know, there's different kinds of practice in medicine, and there's certainly different kinds of practice in law, and this was not at all the area that I was engaged in prior to becoming a member of the Assembly. However, just a couple comments. I know the minister has stated that this is something recommended from the Public Guardian and Trustee Office. And I'm just wondering if there are other circumstances that have led to the formation of this law, and we saw another law on marriage as well. And you know, sometimes people's personal circumstances can cause a lot of discord in family matters, particularly where elderly people get remarried, and these kinds of then issues arise with families debating about the estates of those people. So we'll be able to ask those kinds of questions in committee, Mr. Speaker. Generally, the comments made by the minister in his second reading speech seem to be fairly comprehensive, and I know that we'll have an opportunity to ask more questions in relation to this once we get to the committee stage. So at this point, I would move that we adjourn debate on Bill number 187.
Members move to adjourn debate. Pleasure assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Adjourn debates. Item number 6, resume debate on the second reading motion of Bill number 188, the Public Guardian and Trustee Amendment Act 2019. Mr. Forbes.
Recognize a member for Regina Elphinstone Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Again, good to stand in the Assembly, take my place, and join debate on Bill number 188, the Public Guardian and Trustee Amendment Act 2019. Again, Mr. Speaker, there are a number of updates to the legislation, definition of letters of administration added to the list of defined terms in the previous act, providing that the Public Guardian and Trustee is the official administrator for Saskatchewan, replacing the reference to next friend in sections 20 and 21 with litigation guardian. Again, I'm sure that there's a great legal purpose for that, Mr. Speaker, but the transition from next friend to litigation guardian, I'd be interested to hear the rationale from that. For that, from the drafters, providing that the Public Guardian and Trustee may act as the litigation guardian, adding that the public guardian and trustee shall cease to act on the earliest of the date another person is appointed to act. Setting out the powers of the public guardian and trustee as an applicant for letters of administration, and setting out the public guardian and trustee's authority to administer small estates. Again, Mr. Speaker, all things in keeping with the general thrust of this kind of legislation and this kind of authority, which is fairly significant for those under the terms of the Act, Mr. Speaker. As well, the Act provides for compensation agreements between prospective beneficiaries and air locator companies and limits compensation to 10% of the distributable value of the estate. It also permits the public guardian and trustee to renew a suspension of payment of funds for 30 additional days to a financial institution, and repeals certain sections of the Act, moving them to the Administrations of Estates Act, which of course is dealt with here on the agenda as well, Mr. Speaker. And I guess, Mr. Speaker, we'll be looking to our justice critic and certainly to various of our colleagues with the legal expertise, as well as the sector more broadly, Mr. Speaker, in terms of whether or not these measures meet the mark. But with that, Mr. Speaker, I know we'll undertake that and other measures in aid of due diligence. And as such, I'd move to adjourn debate on Bill number 188, the Public Guardian and Trustee Amendment Act 2019.
Members move to adjourn debate. Pleasure assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Adjourn debates. Item number 7. Resume debate on the second reading motion of Bill number 189, the Coroner's Amendment Act 2019. Ms. Chartier.
Recognize the member for Regina Rosemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to enter in briefly this afternoon to debate for Bill number 189, the Coroner's Amendment Act 2019. Certainly the coroners, the work of the coroner, that office, that person, their team is so important to our province, and I simply want to say thank you to our Chief Coroner, who has served this province for generations, Mr. Speaker, in such an honourable way. And certainly thankful as well to those that have served in this role before. But to Clive Wayhill, I certainly say thank you so very much for your continued service to the people of the province. It's important anytime you open up an act like the Coroner's Act for such an important office that we get it right. Certainly there's some valuable improvements that have been brought forward in this act, certainly as expressed by the minister. We'll continue to consult on this front. I know our critic, very able critic, has been consulting, and we welcome the input of stakeholders at this time, because certainly when you have an act that's opened up, it's an important time to make sure that the changes that are made are as responsive as they can be, and that we have an act that enables the work of the coroner for generations, Mr. Speaker. Certainly, we are interested in knowing what measures will be put in place to ensure that the recommendations from the inquests are followed up on. That's an important piece. Also, we wonder what measures will be put in place to address delays in toxicology analysis. Certainly that's important to the work of the coroner, important to the public. And we also are interested in knowing what's the plan to implement the following recommendations, those being the implementation of an inquest review committee, putting in place a formal child death review committee, addition of a forensic toxicology laboratory, development of a mass casualty plan, increasing training for community coroners, hiring an advocate for families going through an inquest, increasing cultural awareness with respect to the culture and rituals of Indigenous and new Canadians, application of the calls to action from the TRC's report. And there's many other questions that certainly we'll be following up at committee and that we've been engaged with community on, Mr. Speaker. There's changes that are brought about, changes in some of the definitions and changing in some of the powers that certainly seem valuable and reasonable. But those are just some of the questions that we have for the minister, and we'll look for every opportunity to strengthen this piece of legislation. So we invite all stakeholders to offer their input at this point in time to certainly to our critic and to the official opposition, but to government as well, to make sure that we take advantage of the opportunity while we have this important act open, that we get it right for the people of the province. So with respect to Bill number 189, the Coroner's Amendment Act 2019, I'll adjourn debate at this time.
The member for Regina Rosemont has moved to adjourn debate on Bill 189. It's the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Adjourn debates. Item number 8. Resume debate on the second reading motion of Bill number 194, the Miscellaneous Municipal Statutes Amendment Act 2019. Mr. Peterson.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon Riversdale, not Regina Rosemont.
Choice, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
Good choice indeed. That's unanimous.
I am pleased to enter the discussion here on Bill number 194, the Miscellaneous Municipal Statutes Amendment Act 2019, a very important bill before us. It amends 3 acts that govern municipalities, so the Cities Act, the Municipalities Act, and the Northern Municipalities Act 2010, Mr. Speaker. These 3 acts together set bounds and establish the framework for all municipalities to operate, govern, and are governed. So it's important to get this right, Mr. Speaker. The Minister in her second reading speech points out the different areas highlighted in these particular changes. So the first amendments, or the types of amendments, are, as the Minister points out, are protection of reprisals, which protects municipal employees who report wrongdoing. And which is interesting to me, Mr. Deputy Speaker, because that harkens me back to a discussion of a week or 2 ago around protecting the importance of protecting other people who come forward around concerns that they might experience in their workplace. Just would like to point out that when it comes to the Saskatchewan Health Authority, or the SHA, that there is no protection for health workers, Mr. Deputy Speaker, in the existing whistleblower legislation. There wasn't protection in the previous iteration prior to us amalgamating to one health authority, Mr. Deputy Speaker, but we'd be more than open to making that change to make sure that SHA employees now could feel comfortable speaking out and reporting wrongdoing. So this point around protection, so with respect to Bill 194, the protection of reprisals, which protects municipal employees who report wrongdoing, is super important, but it's also important to think about that across other sectors, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and we have an opportunity in this legislative session to make that change and protect health workers who feel compelled in the need to speak about things going on in their own workplaces. The second set of changes, Mr. Speaker, as outlined by the Minister, are in the category of amendments proposed simply as administrative efficiencies for municipalities. The third area are aiming at strengthening and improving local government, she points out, and the final area of amendments were proposed in this bill to, she says, responding to stakeholder requests for improvements to the legislation. And at the beginning of her comments, she talks about these coming forward out of conversations with municipal sector stakeholders and what they have had a chance to suggest and review many proposals. So in this time, Mr. Deputy Speaker, it's important to make sure that when you're creating legislation, that those impacted by legislation have had a good opportunity to provide input, and that their input is well listened to and regarded, and that we aren't creating any unintended consequences, Mr. Deputy Speaker. So this is the time, and I always say this for folks at home too, that when bills come before us, this is at this time of year, it's an opportunity for folks to reach out to members of the legislature to flag any concerns that they might have, and then bills eventually are likely to be passed in the spring, Mr. Deputy Speaker. So we will be doing our due diligence to ensure that those people who needed to be consulted were consulted in a meaningful way and had ample opportunity to bring their issues forward and to find out if there's anything that is missing in this bill that should be included, or if there's anything in this bill that is problematic. So that will be our work here in opposition, to hold the government to account, to make sure that the legislation does what it intends to do. But with that, I know I'll have colleagues who will wade into the discussion here in days coming forward. But with that, I'd like to move to adjourn debate on Bill number 194, the Miscellaneous Municipal Statutes Amendment Act 2019.
The member from Saskatoon Riversdale has moved to adjourn debate on Bill 194. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Adjourn debates, item number 9. Resume debate on the second reading motion of Bill number 195, the Lobbyist Amendment Act 2019. Ms. Chartier.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon Fairview.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, it's my pleasure to enter into debate on Bill number 195, the Lobbyist Amendment Act today. This bill proposes to make a few different changes. It reduces the threshold for registration as an in-house lobbyist from 100 to 30 hours. Exempts nonprofit charitable organizations with less than 5 employees who lobby for a total of less than 30 hours annually from registering as an in-house lobbyist, prohibits a consultant lobbyist and in-house lobbyist from providing gifts or benefits to a public office holder, and adds a definition of gift or personal benefit, and creates an exception for gifts provided as part of protocol and valued as less than $200. We've been pretty clear in our position and pretty public in our position on this bill. We introduced Bill 615 last spring that would have eliminated the threshold for registration rather than decreasing it to 30 hours. We believe that the threshold should be eliminated altogether. And we also have maintained the stance that no public officer shall accept a gift except for an MLA, and if the gift is in accordance with the Members' Conflict of Interest Act, which we all know there are specific rules that govern how and if we can receive gifts and what the reporting of that information looks like on a broader scale. Essentially, this has created a smaller loophole, and we don't think it's good enough. Under this proposed legislation, someone could meet with a minister for coffee once a week for an entire year. If we're talking about a 30-minute meeting, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and that wouldn't be recorded in any way. 30 hours is still a significant period of time, and the public deserves to know what lobbying has taken place so that they can hold the government accountable for the decisions that it's making. So we believe that the threshold should be eliminated so that all lobbying activity is on the public record, and the Registrar of Lobbyists, Ron Barclay, has also called for the same thing. So this is the type of transparency that we should have around lobbying in our province, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I know that we will be doing some consultations and digging into this even further, but with that, I would move to adjourn debate on this bill for today.
The member from Saskatoon Fairview has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 195. Is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Adjourn debate. Item number 10, resume debate on the second reading motion of Bill number 196, the Members' Conflict of Interest Amendment Act 2019. Mr. McCall.
I recognize the member from Prince Albert North.
Speaker, it again is an honour to stand today and put my remarks on the record with regards to bill debate and this particular bill, Bill number 196, the Members' Conflict of Interest Amendment Act, is a really important piece of legislation, Mr. Deputy Speaker. There's a lot of professions where conflict of interest is of much importance, and this profession is definitely one of them because, Mr. Deputy Speaker, it's so important that we have public confidence that decisions that are being made in this House are made on the benefits of all residents of Saskatchewan and not on a personal level. And it's very important that residents of Saskatchewan can have that level of confidence and that we're fully transparent and accountable for the decisions and any potential conflict of interest that may occur, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I know with other professions such as social work, that's definitely an area that's of importance as well, you know, and knowing internally what potentially could be a conflict of interest is important, and it's hard to identify that on a conflict of interest form as such that we fill out every year. But in this particular context, it's more so of a level of assets. And so the Conflict of Interest Commissioner recommended in his 2018 annual report that some changes be made with regards to the descriptions that we provide with any potential conflict of interest, which is assets or connections with any private companies or companies that a member may be owner or a member of. And so currently we do disclosure forms. We are required to do that every year, and the Commissioner, he gets a description. The disclosure requirements at this time have been not as lengthy as what the Commissioner felt that maybe needed to be made public. And so now the information about involvements with different assets of private companies, we're hoping will be a bit more of a broader description of what those companies are. Mr. Deputy Speaker, it wasn't until I actually became a member here that I learned of numbered companies. I don't have any involvement with a numbered company. I knew nothing about them. And I think probably the majority of residents in Saskatchewan don't really know they exist or what they're about. And it seems a bit interesting why there wouldn't be more of a description of what these numbered companies are. And so I'm hoping with changes to this legislation that will provide a little bit more detail of the description of what those companies are, because I think the residents of Saskatchewan deserve to have that answer so that they can see that, that no member is in conflict. And so, again, because if the more transparent we are, then the more confidence we'll have in the residents of Saskatchewan. And so I know there's going to be some changes to the definition of gift or personal benefit, and a requirement that describes of assets of private companies controlled by a member or their member's family be included in the disclosure statements, because we also want to ensure that nobody who has a personal connection to a member is also benefiting from any decisions made in this Assembly. And it requires a former member to file a disclosure statement within with the Commissioner within 60 days after ceasing to be a member. So that timely process is very important for members of the province to be able to have access to that information. All of our disclosure statements are made public, so anybody in Saskatchewan can go on the website and take a look at that, and so then they know who is involved with certain companies as well. And so I think because of the importance of this piece of legislation, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that it is so important that this is done the right way, and there's some discussion within committee on some of the questions as to what this is going to entail. Hopefully the changes in this particular legislation are very meaningful and does provide a lot more accountability, and so that the members of the public have access to exactly what conflicts members can have. And so I know I have members on my side of the House here that will also want to add some discussion with regards to changes to this piece of legislation because it impacts every one of us. And so with that, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm going to adjourn debate on Bill number 196.
The members move to adjourn debate on Bill number 196. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Adjourn debates. Item number 11, resume debate on the second reading motion of Bill number 197, the Automobile Accident Insurance Amendment Act 2019. Ms. Mowat.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon-Riversdale.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's my pleasure to enter the discussion on Bill number 197, the Automobile Accident Insurance Amendment Act 2019, Mr. Speaker. This particular bill governs how motor vehicle accident injury and death benefits are paid. I always find it useful, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to take a look at the minister's second reading speech to get a sense of where the government is coming from with respect to the bill, and then between now and the spring we have an opportunity to see if that, if the bill itself, the minister's second reading speech and reality line up, and if people in the community agree that these changes are good or not. But it's always a good place to start to find out where the government is coming from. And in his second reading speech, the minister talks about one of the proposed changes being to the appeal provision under the Act, for which SGI and the Ministry of Justice share responsibility. He points out that the change would require that SGI and a claimant first have leave of the Court of Appeal before appealing a decision of the Court of Queen's Bench or a decision of the Injury Appeal Commission to the Saskatchewan Court of Appeal. The minister explains in his second reading speech that the Act at this moment provides for an automatic right of appeal on a question of law, which means that before the merits of an appeal are verified, a full panel of the court is required to invest time in preparing for the hearing and then must entertain oral argument and render a decision. He points out that the Chief Justice of the Court of Appeal for Saskatchewan has requested this amendment to avoid requiring a full panel of the court to be engaged on an appeal that lacks merit. And the minister believes this change better respects the court's time and makes things more efficient, and maintains the right to appeal a decision of the Injury Appeal Commission or the Court of Queen's Bench. It's always good to hear where a bill is coming from or where a change is coming from. As the minister points out, the Chief Justice of the Court of Appeal has requested this amendment, so this will be a time where the critic responsible will reach out to folks to find out if this is in fact what has been requested, or if there was maybe sometimes stakeholders and people want a particular thing and it doesn't quite transpire exactly how stakeholders like the Chief Justice of the Court of Appeal had meant, but I'll take the minister on his word at this point in time, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The second point here that the minister mentions is that the amendment removes references of any law in the Act and replaces them with references to any law of any jurisdiction. to address the risk under the current wording that any law could be narrowly interpreted to mean Saskatchewan law only. And specifically, the proposed change clarifies that when a license or a driving permit is suspended, revoked or cancelled under any law of any jurisdiction, their driver's license is automatically suspended, revoked or cancelled in Saskatchewan. That sounds eminently reasonable. Mr. Deputy Speaker, if you can't drive, if your license has been revoked for some reason in another jurisdiction, you probably shouldn't be able to drive here, so that sounds like it's a good clarifying piece there. The minister also points out that this legislation, these amendments clarify that the surrender of someone's license or other driving permit to a judge under any law of any jurisdiction automatically cancels that person's driver's license in Saskatchewan. So it goes the same for what we were just saying. If someone has been suspended elsewhere and shouldn't be able to get a license here, and vice versa, Mr. Speaker, if the license is suspended here, that it should, or it's suspended elsewhere, that it should be suspended here. The minister points out that it also clarifies a condition of the first-party property damage insurance and third-party liability insurance that vehicles cannot be operated in violation of any laws or any jurisdiction restricting weight, use, hours of operation, territory, number of passengers, and transportation of goods. And there are also a number of housekeeping changes around gender-neutral language, which is always really important with language, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Language sends a message about who we are in the world, people's importance, and gender. There was a time, actually, when I was a reporter many, many years ago, and I scoffed, this was 20-plus years ago, scoffed at the idea of gender-neutral language, and I've come a long way in my own education and learning the importance of language and the message that it sends to others and to ourselves, Mr. Speaker. So I'm always in favour of those kinds of, albeit simple, important changes. But we have critics in the opposition who are charged with taking a closer look at legislation, and generally our team does as well. So over the forthcoming months, I know my colleague will be taking a close look at that, and we'll have an opportunity in committee to ask some good questions, I'm sure. But for the moment, I would like to move to adjourn debate on Bill number 197, the Automobile Accident Insurance Amendment Act 2019.
The member from Saskatoon-Riversdale has moved to adjourn debate on Bill 197. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Adjourn debates. Item number 12, resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill number 198, the Traffic Safety Amendment Act 2019. Mr. Weatherspoon.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon-Nutana.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'm pleased to rise today to enter into the debate on this bill. Obviously, our first reference point when reviewing this is the speech of the minister in the second reading when it's first brought into the House on second reading, Mr. Speaker. And the minister spent quite a bit of time talking about several parts of the amendments that are being proposed to the Traffic Safety Act, in particular distracted driving and changes related to that, and also impaired driving, some changes related to that, and participation in an ignition interlock program, a collision involving a semi, and mandatory truck training. But the one, and there's a few other things here, including transportation of children in taxis or rideshare vehicles. But the one I really want to talk about today is a really interesting topic, Mr. Speaker, to me, and it's about autonomous vehicles. And there are a number of changes to the Traffic Safety Act that deals with autonomous vehicles. And as we know, those are more commonly referred to as driverless vehicles, Mr. Speaker, and we're at an age, in a day and age, when that is a reality that is becoming more and more commonplace on the highways. So the Speaker spoke a little bit about that, but as far as I can see, he really didn't cover the changes at all in his comments, and I think we need to examine those a little bit more. And the one I'm most interested in, Mr. Speaker, is in the changes in the new Part 6.1, which is automated and connected vehicles. There's a series of definitions about what an automated vehicle is there, but a connected vehicle. Now, Mr. Speaker, would you have any knowledge of what a connected vehicle is? I didn't either until I started looking at this bill. But here's the definition, Mr. Speaker, of connected vehicle. It means a prescribed vehicle. Well, what the heck are we supposed to make of that, Mr. Speaker? I mean, there's absolutely no clarity in this definition about what it is we're talking about, and I think that's one of the problems. In fact, if you look at the Traffic Safety Act, Mr. Speaker, there in the section that tells you what is prescribed under the regulations, it's actually 15 pages long. Just in everything that's been referred to the regulations under the Traffic Safety Act. And even in this bill, there's a whole new page of items that are being added to the regulations section under 287 of the existing Act. And all of these changes, as far as I can tell, or most of them relate to automated vehicles or this thing called connected vehicles. So, Mr. Speaker, I've turned to Wikipedia to maybe get on the record a little bit about what Wikipedia says connected cars are. And there is a definition here, Mr. Speaker. What is a connected car? A connected car is a car that is one that can communicate bidirectionally with other systems outside the car. Now, I read on in the article, and you will remember the very first example of a connected car, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and it was pretty famous in the time. It was in 1996. It was introduced by General Motors, and I don't know if you're remembering yet exactly what it was, but it was something called OnStar. So that was back in the day when we could just push a button, and through the wonders of the internet and satellite technology, some person at the end of the line would come on and say, "How can I help you? This is OnStar." And it was revolutionary when you think about it, Mr. Speaker, because no matter where you were, as long as you could get satellite technology, or through the telephones, I assume, you could actually get someone to help you out. That wasn't within the vehicle itself. So it says here that General Motors was the first automaker to bring the first connected car features to market with OnStar in 1996 in the Cadillac DeVille, the Seville, and the Eldorado. And OnStar was created by GM working with Motorola. So the primary purpose was safety and get emergency help when there was an accident. That just was the beginning, Mr. Speaker, of what connected vehicles are today. In 2001, remote diagnostics were introduced. In 2003, connected car services included vehicle health reports, turn-by-turn directions. Do you remember when the first GPS started showing up in our cars? That is part of a connected car, where we can get turn-by-turn directions. In the summer of 2014, Audi was the first automaker to offer 4G LTE Wi-Fi hotspots access. By 2015, OnStar had processed 1 billion requests from customers. That's how much it's grown. In 2017, European technology startup Stratio Automotive provides over 10,000 vehicles with predictive intelligence, enabling fleet operators to better maintain and manage their vehicles. So, Mr. Speaker, you can just imagine the explosion in what a connected car has become since OnStar was introduced. There are 5 ways a vehicle can be communicated in a connected way. First is vehicle to infrastructure, and that's data that's generated by the vehicle and provides information about the infrastructure to the driver. So that's when our car talks to us. Safety, mobility, or environment-related conditions. So, for example, if your wheels are sliding on ice, Mr. Speaker, I think most cars now have a little light that comes on, tells you that it's slippery. Vehicle to vehicle is the second kind, and this communicates information about speed and position of surrounding vehicles through a wireless exchange of information. And I know in the new RAV4, for example, if you get too close to a car in front of you or to the side, and other rental cars I've driven, there's a warning that you are too close, so it's actually predicting outside of the vehicle. Vehicle to cloud is the third kind of connected car technology, and that exchanges information about apps on the vehicle with a cloud system. So smart homes, you can connect to your home through your car now, or energy and transportation. A lot of these are making use of this vehicle to cloud technology. The fourth is vehicle to pedestrian. So the technology would sense information about the environment and communicate it to other vehicles. So, for example, the vehicle can communicate with pedestrians. And it used to be called a horn, but I think now we have this new technology that's alerting pedestrians to the existence of your vehicle. And then finally, the fifth kind of connected car technology is called vehicle to everything. And this technology would interconnect all types of vehicles and infrastructure systems with another, including cars, highways, ships, trains, and airplanes. So this is obviously an exploding area, and I'm glad to see that these definitions are being included in the bill. Of course, it's not a definition, it's just a referral to the regulations, which is one of my favorite complaints, Mr. Speaker, is there just isn't enough in the bill for us as legislators to be able to decide if it makes sense or not. And we don't get to see the regulations until after the bill is passed and after the regulations are passed. There is some identified drawbacks and challenges to this type of technology and connected car. And the major complaint these days is hackability. So every time you have an interconnected system, Mr. Speaker, it opens the door for hackers to get in there. And in fact, in Germany, Brazil, 59% of car drivers are afraid to be hacked into their car if it's connected to the internet. 43% in the States and 53% in China. So people are concerned. Reliability is also a major concern, and I know that's a concern with automatic driving systems as well, although humans probably have as many flaws as some of those systems. So there's a very interesting article about this on Wikipedia, and I assume that this is a burgeoning industry that has all kinds of developing technologies exploding through things that we've already seen come into our cars, but also you can only imagine what we'll see next. So I just wanted to get that on the record a little bit, Mr. Speaker. I think many people are familiar with automated driving systems, but the idea of the connectivity of cars is still in its infancy in some ways, although much of it is stuff we already take for granted, like when your ABS, your automatic braking system light comes on, or all those things on your dashboard that we currently have that we wouldn't have had even 10 or 15 years ago. We wouldn't have had them in the aughts, Mr. Speaker. That's a term that I learned the other day when we're talking about the first 10 years of this millennium. It's not the zeros, it's not the, we have the 20s and the 30s and the 40s. Well, all of this technology was developed in the aughts, and that's a new word for me that I'm going to be using because I like it. Anyways, Mr. Speaker, I'm sure my colleagues are going to have lots to say about other aspects of this bill, but I just want to get that discussion on connected vehicles on the record, and wish that there had been more information about that in the minister's second reading speech. But for now, I would move that we adjourn debate on Bill number 198, an act to amend the Traffic Safety Act.
The member from Saskatoon-Natana has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 198. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Adjourn debates. Item number 13, resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill number 199, the Opioid Damages and Healthcare Costs Recovery Act. Ms. Sproul.
I recognize the member from Regina Northeast.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. This bill was just released here, I guess it was last week, and I think the main thrust of it is to allow this government to join with BC in a class action lawsuit against manufacturers and wholesalers of opioids here in Saskatchewan, or opioids that are distributed here in Saskatchewan. The minister summarized the claim in his second reading remarks that drug companies have been deceiving, quote, prescribers and patients about the risks and benefits of opioids, and they have seriously harmed individuals, families, and the public health care system, close quotes. As you know, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we have a number of serious drug issues and addictions issues in our society today, and the uses of opioids and overuses and addictions to opioids has caused really incalculable social harm, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, there was some news on this very issue back in the summer, coming out of the provincial auditor's report, and the provincial auditor noted that the Ministry of Health here in our province doesn't monitor the dispensing practices of the pharmacies in the province when it comes to opioids, and that's an area where we could really stand to have some improvement. And I gather that the auditor recommended a new policy be put in place for prescribers so that a patient's medication history would be reviewed before prescribing high-risk medications like opioids. Mr. Deputy Speaker, this is and this isn't just about addictions. This is about deaths. We've had overdoses. We've had lives ruined by opioid addictions and opioid poisonings. Regina and Saskatoon had the most hospitalizations related to opioid poisoning per capita in Canada back a couple of years ago. In Regina, that was 28.3 people per 100,000 people a day, and while Saskatoon was 26.1 per 100,000 people per day. And in both cases, that was almost double the national average of 16 people per 100,000. So this is a serious problem. It's a serious problem for us in the province, and it's something that needs to get dealt with. Between April 1st of 2018 and March 31st of 2019, so in other words, the last fiscal year, there was over 440,000 opioid prescriptions filled in Saskatchewan. And then there was another 300 and almost another 360,000 prescriptions dispensed to treat addiction such as methadone. So this gives you an idea, Mr. Deputy Speaker, of the size of the problem here in the province. I do want to note, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that last year there was 119 deaths in our province due to opioid toxicity, and that's a problem. That means that there's 119 families out there that are grieving the loss of a loved one. Earlier this sitting, Mr. Deputy Speaker, had the pleasure of meeting with some of the chiropractors in the province, and they were informing us that their profession, chiropractic, is very important for pain management and for actually not just pain management, but for treating and improving conditions, especially musculoskeletal conditions. They noted that back pain was a big proportion of the reason for hospital visits. They noted that opioids were prescribed in high number for a lot of those conditions, but that, in fact, chiropractic, they told us, was actually more effective and, of course, not addictive in actually dealing with people's pain. And so that's important, Mr. Deputy Speaker, because they were informing us that the province no longer covers chiropractic services for social services recipients. And so, there's a significant chunk of people in our province who need help, who aren't getting the best help that they could. Instead of getting chiropractic services that would possibly fix their problems and prevent them from becoming addicted to opioids or experiencing opioid toxicity, they were instead basically being medicated to deal with their pain, and because that was a covered cost by the province. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'd be remiss if I didn't also mention the fact that crystal meth has also taken over in terms of illicit drug sales here in our province. It's part of the larger issues that we're seeing when we talk about suicides in the north and gang presence both in northern communities but also here in our own city. Opioids is also part of that issue, but crystal meth is quite a problem, and the Chief of Police here in our own city talked about how, I'm not 100% sure on this number, but I think he said there was a 2,600% increase in crystal meth-related incidents that the police in our city were seeing. So I am glad to see that the government is taking steps on this issue to ensure that manufacturers of the drugs are held accountable. But I would have liked to have seen more action for people against the people who manufacture crystal meth. I'd like to see more action dealing with helping people who are experiencing addictions. And you know, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm sure many people here in the House have this, but there's many friends of my family who have experienced opioid addictions, and this is an issue that cuts across. It cuts across income lines. It cuts across cultural lines. It cuts across language lines, geographic lines. This is an issue for everybody in the province. It's an issue for all families, and so we really do need to take the issue of addictions and mental health much more seriously in our province than what I'm seeing this government do. Before I wrap up, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I would just like to again reiterate that before this House is another bill calling for the government to implement a suicide prevention strategy, a bill that wouldn't require the expenditure of public money. It's a bill that is long overdue and would help, even if it helped reduce one single suicide in this province, it would be worthwhile. And so, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I have great difficulty understanding the government's intransigence on passing that bill, or even letting it come to the floor past the stage it's at right now. So, with that, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm going to sit down, and I'll move that we adjourn debate on this bill.
The member from Regina Northeast has moved to adjourn debate on Bill 199. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Adjourn debates. Item number 14, resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill number 200, the Saskatchewan Employment Amendment Act 2019. Mr. Belanger.
I recognize the member from Regina Rosemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to enter in briefly this afternoon to debate with respect to Bill number 200, the Saskatchewan Employment Act 2019. This bill aims to do a few things. It extends parental leave from 63 to 71 weeks. It provides 86 weeks of parental leave if two employees are taking leave with respect to the same child. It expands candidate public office leave to include employees that are running for election to a band council. It allows the Labour Relations Board to produce a written decision following a delayed adjudication process and to replace the adjudicator if a decision is not provided. It goes on as well. It authorizes radiation health officers to issue compliance undertakings and notice of contraventions. Amends penalty provisions to provide the second and subsequent offences. So it aims to do a number of things as expressed by the minister. Certainly we'll do our due diligence on this file and consult with workers and with stakeholders and employers on this front. Anytime that you're making changes to the Employment Act, it's important that we get it right. Certainly the extension of things like parental leave are very important and valued by new parents, and something that we, of course, are fully supportive of. So I think there seems to be a lot of reasonable measures in this bill here. We have learned to, question this government with their approach to Labour. It wasn't so long ago that they brought forward a bill without consultation that was unconstitutional, that enshrined the right to strike, that cost taxpayers a whole lot of their hard-earned money, Mr. Speaker, in the pursuit of defending that unconstitutional, reckless legislation, Mr. Speaker. So we'll engage in consultation with workers and with Labour and with employers to make sure that there aren't any unintended consequences within this legislation, Mr. Speaker. At this point in time, though, I'll adjourn debate with respect to Bill number 200, the Saskatchewan Employment Act 2019.
The member has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 200. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Adjourn debates. Item number 15. Resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill number 201, the Alcohol and Gaming Regulation Amendment Act 2019. Mr. Belanger.
I recognize the member from Regina Northeast.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. So it's my privilege today to enter into debate on what the government has titled the Alcohol and Gaming Regulation Amendment Act 2019, Bill number 201, but I think more appropriately, Mr. Deputy Speaker, it would actually be called the Continued Privatization of the Liquor Industry in Saskatchewan Bill. Mr. Deputy Speaker, you know, it's interesting, this sitting here, I've seen the Minister of Justice stand up several times and tell us that SaskTel is not for sale. But I haven't seen him answer the question about who was on the Cabinet Committee on Crown Structures. Haven't seen anybody answer that question yet. It's funny, it's almost like nobody wants to admit that they were on the committee. And here again, we have another example of privatization. In my constituency, Regina Northeast, of course, the former member from this my constituency was the Minister of Finance, and I was told by a constituent when I was out campaigning that former member assured him that STC wasn't going to be privatized, that STC was absolutely safe, and no sooner was the government re-elected back in 2016 than STC got privatized a year later, sold off for scrap pieces. So there's a long track record here, Mr. Deputy Speaker, on privatization, and this is yet another step. When I look at the Minister's comments about the need for this bill, the Minister said, and I quote, that Saskatchewan was at the mercy is the quote, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The Minister said that we were at the mercy of Alberta and BC warehouses, and that Saskatchewan liquor vendors couldn't get liquor, specialty liquor, into Saskatchewan fast enough through the SLGA, and so they need to have private warehouses. Well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, you don't need legislation to improve SLGA's warehousing ability. You just need to actually run the company better, and actually have to have a mindset that you actually want SLGA to be run better. But we know, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that this government doesn't want SLGA to be run better. We know that this government wants SLGA out of the business. They keep cutting away its market share. They keep privatizing the stores. And now they want to privatize the warehousing function. And so that's what this bill is about, pure and simple, is privatization of SLGA's business functions. Just like they privatized SCC, just like they were going to privatize SaskTel if they'd had the chance, just like they've cut away at the functions of our core crowns, SaskTel, SaskPower, SaskEnergy. So much of their business functions have been contracted out to private companies, and this is just another example of privatization from a government who would rather take an ideological position on this than actually look at the dollars and cents merits of having businesses owned by the province, generating money for the province, and making our province better. So with that, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm going to wrap up my comments. I move that we adjourn debate on this bill.
The member from Regina Northeast has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 201. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried. I recognize the Government House Leader.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I move that this House do now adjourn.
The Government House Leader has moved that this House adjourn. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. This House stands adjourned until tomorrow at 1:30 p.m.